Okay, so I'm Finn. I'm joined by Will MacAskill on our first video podcast. Thanks for joining me, Will.
That's exciting.
Let's set some context to begin with. What are we going to be talking about for the next 3 hours?
Yeah, so this is the Better Futures essay series. So this is a series of essays, some of which we have co-authored, Finn and I. And the core focus of it is a perspective that we call the Better Futures perspective, which is primarily focused on thinking, okay, how can we not merely avoid the risk of catastrophe in the sense of having a future that's of approximately zero value, like about the value of extinction or comparable, but instead go from not just an okay future, but to a truly great future. And the series as a whole is structured around the idea of arguing that that is at least in the same ballpark of importance as reducing the risk of extinction or other existential catastrophes.
Now, this piece you've been writing and I've been helping write over the last few months, ideas are older than that. Kind of want to hear a bit about the backstory of how it came to be.
Sure. So I've been thinking about this since at least 2017 or earlier. So I gave a presentation for the Global Priorities Institute in 2017, where there I presented what we now call the SF model that we'll talk about. The basic model of just dividing things up into chance we survive and how well things can go given that we survive, and started making the first arguments for the thought that actually it's that latter thing, making the future even better given that we survive, that's the more important thing to work on. Then I, after that, kind of wrote What We Owe the Future, and that book is distinctive in that there's a lot more focus on values, for example, the risk of AI-enabled dictatorship, than other work in that vein. And I actually considered making the whole book just about that. In some ways, I have some regrets. Like maybe I wish I had done that. It would have been more distinctive, more focused on the things that I was...
More about value lock-in, you're saying?
More about value lock-in, and would have been a bit less about extinction, which is already super well covered by, for example, the precipice. Either way, it meant that I felt like there was a little bit of an open loop there. And so I was very happy to return to this topic and try to deal with these ideas in more depth.
Well, the piece begins with this model of the future, and you elaborate on it in this technical report as well. Tell me a bit about it.
So, the model of the future is super simple. You look at the expected value of the future that's coming from a product of two things. One, probability that we survive, and two, the value of the future given that we survive. By survival, what I mean is the chance that we don't essentially guarantee that we end up in a near zero value future. So it doesn't have to be literally extinction, which would mean that there's no value in the future at all, coming from human originating civilization. But it could be other things that are like nearly zero value. So at least the classical understanding of AI takeover risk, where you've got some wildly misaligned AI and all it cares about is paperclips and the whole future civilization just becomes paperclips. That would be a near zero value future too.
Now, presumably at some point humans will go extinct. I imagine you're talking about survival within this century?
Yes, exactly. So it's near-term survival. Because we're broadly coming at this from a long-termist perspective. Not saying that's the only perspective that matters, but that's the context of the series. Near-term is the next 75 years.
Okay, so survival is one of these axes, the chance that we, humanity, survive in the near term, avoid one of these catastrophes. What about that other axis? Say more about that.
So then the other axis is how good or bad is the future given that we survive, where we define a scale for that by saying that a best feasible future is the value of the future that's at the 99.99th percentile of how well things could go. So imagine all the ways the future could go, given that we survive. Take the one that's at the 99.99th percentile. So really goes really well. We just call that stipulatively 100%. Extinction is zero value. And so that means you can talk about how good the future is as a percentage of where it is between that best feasible future and zero.
I see. Yeah, is there more to say about the kind of claims that you're making in this piece in terms of the model you just described?
In the piece, what I'm saying is that the priority of working to increase flourishing, that is the value of the future conditional on survival, is at least in the same ballpark of priority as work to increase the probability of survival. Where I think what we call survival kind of maps onto at least how people use the term existential catastrophe, though there are slight differences if you're looking at it precisely. And I make this claim, using the importance or scale, tractability, neglectedness framework, at least as an organizing structure. I definitely don't think you should be a slave to that framework and follow it blindly, but it's very useful for structuring the argument.
I guess, first of all, what does it mean to say a problem is larger in scale or importance than another?
So that is to say that if you were to wholly solve the problem, you would achieve more value. Things would be better. That's what it means for a problem to be bigger than scale than another. So, if 10 million people die from one disease and 1 million people die from some other disease, on I think the most natural model framework, solving that first problem of that first disease would be more important, bigger in scale than that second one, because it affects 10 times as many people. And you might even say it's 10 times more important.
So to solve the problem of survival would be to guarantee survival in the short term. To solve the problem of flourishing would be to guarantee a best feasible future in the long run. And you're trying to compare the scale of the two problems in that sense.
Yes.
How do you start doing that?
Yeah. And one thing to say is you don't need to think about wholly solving the problem. You could also think about, well, what if we just make a 1% difference reduction to the problem? And using the framework that we use, that just it ends up being the same. You were asking about, okay, well, what's the argument for
which problem's bigger? I mean, intuitively, extinction seems like a really big deal if it were to happen. Making the future better, I don't know, going from a kind of pretty good future by default to a, utopian future, that sounds like perfectionism. Maybe that's smaller in scale. What's wrong with that?
So the underlying thought is perhaps we're quite a lot closer to the ceiling of how well things could go on the surviving dimension than we are on the flourishing dimension. And so in the overview, I give a couple of illustrative numbers, which are in fact, approximately close to my views, which are that, well, maybe we've got an 80% chance of surviving this century, but that the value of the future, if we do survive, is something like 10% that of a best feasible future. If so, then the problem of non-flourishing is actually quite a lot larger than the problem of not surviving. So we've got this diagram that I at least find very useful. In the diagram, you can think of the total amount of value, gained and value lost as areas within the diagram. And you can increase value by either changing the shape of the area on the surviving axis or changing it on the flourishing axis. And the way the maths work out can be a little unintuitive, actually, where if you have 80% chance of surviving and a 10% score on flourishing, that actually means that flourishing is 36 times more important or greater in scale than surviving is. And you might have more extreme views than this. So supposing instead you think that we've got a 99% chance of surviving this century, and the expected value of the future given survival is more like 1%. This isn't far from what my views were like in around about 2017 when I first started working on this. If so, then again, when you do the maths of it, flourishing has 10,000 times the importance or scale of surviving. And wow, that would be really quite a lot. And that's not my all things considered view, but it's at least something that seems worth investigating.
I see. That's quite a weird idea to me. This thought that when we're thinking about these, default scores on both axes, is the idea that this is what we should expect, kind of without intervening. This is the kind of status quo. This is the most likely outcome. What do these scores mean?
Yeah, these are the scores that what you would expect to happen if you weren't to take action. And then, there's a second thought of what the scores would be if you were to take action. I actually think that can provide an additional argument for work on flourishing over scale. This is a little subtle, but the thought here is, okay, you might think 80% chance of surviving, 10% chance of flourishing. You might think, well, what is the world like if I do succeed at increasing the probability of surviving, so reducing existential catastrophe? And you might think, well, a world in which we just barely missed existential catastrophe is probably a world that just doesn't really have its shit together. It's not generally on track. And so, in fact, given that I was in a world where I could successfully reduce existential catastrophe, probably flourishing is lower than I think it is unconditionally. Maybe it's only 5%. So that actually reduces the value of increasing the chance of survival.
Yep.
But the same argument the other way around, I don't think really follows. If I manage to get us from not just an okay future, but to a really good future, I don't think that it therefore follows that, oh, the chance of survival must be very low.
Yeah. So the idea is that the worlds in which survival is most tractable, where it's easiest to move the needle the most, are also going to tend to be the worlds in which solving the problem of survival is less or least important, because the world that you're saving, you should expect to be just less good.
Yeah, exactly.
What about those other two factors, just very briefly?
Sure, yeah. So there's the neglectedness aspect. I don't spend a huge amount of time on this. I'll discuss it a bit in the technical report. But here the thought is that there are arguments for thinking in general you should expect work on flourishing to be more neglected than work on survival, where just take people today's kind of rational self-interest, or even just the rational self-interest from people in the United States. The value of a statistical life, that's, on average, how much are people willing to spend to save their life, where that's worked out for them, actually just reducing the risk of them dying by a small amount, like 1%. That's about $10 million. There are 300 million people in the United States. And so that means you have 3,000 million.
I'm doing the maths for you.
You start to get to very large numbers in terms of the willingness to pay to reduce the risk of a catastrophe that would kill everyone on Earth. Obviously, we're not in the world in which the United States as a whole is a perfectly rational
coordination
actor.
there.
But there's at least this huge latent desire. And that means that there is enormous potential. And potential that I do, in fact, expect to get progressively realized if we're in a world where existential risk is high, to take really large actions to reduce that risk. In the way that we saw that, the world woke up to COVID, the response was all over the place and it was very inefficient, but there was a willingness to effectively spend trillions of dollars.
And that's not to say that extinction or catastrophe risk is, appropriately weighted, is not massively neglected still, because usually it is.
Exactly.
But there's at least some reason for people to care about it.
Yes, exactly. I use a lot of technical language. The basic thought is people don't want to die.
Yeah.
They really care about not dying. And you're right. We're not going to get close to even the rational amount of expenditure just from the narrow perspective of the United States, let alone the perspective of everyone in the world, let alone the perspective of that and future generations. But let's then compare with some things that we might want to do from the perspective of flourishing, especially if you are coming at this from, a perspective that's sympathetic to long-termism, not even long-termism in the sense of looking to billions of years hence, but even just, you're concerned about thousands of years hence. Well, that includes things that people often just are very unbothered by and will continue to be unbothered by, like what is the governance of deep space, including what happens with all of the star systems and galaxies outside of our solar system, or how do we treat digital beings like AIs, not just
animals,
now, but far into the future,
example.
or even just animals as well. That's something that's highly value laden, and because it's not in people's self-interest to care about animal welfare, we have a world where we have 70 billion animals kept in horrific conditions on factory farms every year.
So there are some kind of hand-wavy reasons to think that working on Flourishing is going to look more neglected, at least Flourishing in the kind of narrow, long-termist focus sense that
that's right.
You're talking about. And then there's this final factor, which is tractability. Is there anything that anyone can actually do to make the world better if we survive? You might think that there really isn't because actions just wash out. We'll talk about that more in detail, but just briefly, is there anything we can do?
Sure. Yeah. So I absolutely think this is where, the weakest part of the overall case. And if the case falls apart, I think it falls apart here. And so, the last two essays are addressing this in two different ways. If for extinction risk reduction or otherwise existential risk reduction, there's this enormous untapped latent desire, well, that's great. You can just unlock that in order to make progress. Whereas perhaps you're in fact pushing for some things that you work on in Flourishing, you might in fact actually be pushing against people's self-interest. So again, think of, trying to make progress on animal welfare, where that's tough because a lot of people they like cheap chicken, and that makes it harder. There are certain other kind of higher level considerations on tractability too. But I think there's a couple of things to say in its favor, where one is it's hard for expected tractability to go very low, especially in areas where there hasn't been a lot of work done yet, because, well, you should at least have some decent probability on the thought that if you do some work on it, you'll actually discover it's much more tractable than you thought.
There's some uncertainty. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And part of the optimism I have is having been around work, say around AI existential risk, AI takeover risk, and even biorisk as well, where if you go back to even 2014, 2015, this just seemed so intractable. There was nothing to do. But there was just foundational work done to figure out, okay, actually, these are the angles that we can take where it does seem like we'd make meaningful progress on AI misalignment and on reducing the risk of worst-case pandemics too. And now we're in a world where it's like, oh, these actually seem comparatively tractable. There's so much we could do.
Yeah.
And so maybe the same is true for these other areas. And so what are these other areas? Well, some of the things I highlight include risk of concentration of power among humans. So you can think of human takeover as quite structurally similar to AI takeover. Could be ultimately a single person, a single global dictator, but could also just be a concentration to the hands of a small group. Second, how we treat digital beings, AIs. So I expect most beings in the future to be digital rather than biological. Either just what is their welfare like, but also just what system of rights have we given them? How are AIs and humans like coexisting in society? I expect that to be this major path-dependent decision. And then third, as we mentioned, is governance of resources in deep space, where that amounts to essentially everything that will ever get, all the resources that will ever be used. And currently there's just nothing, the world says nothing about them, essentially, in terms of how is that governed. But I think, again, that could be a huge path-dependent moment. And then there's a bunch of other cross-cutting considerations. Can be just, if we think there's going to be a near-term intelligence explosion where AI drives very rapid progress in AI capabilities and then technological progress, maybe just generally slowing that down, having, better informed, more competent, more morally responsible, more cooperative people at the helm during this transition. These things could be very important in a cross-cutting way that would help across many things that could affect how flourishing the future we get.
So zooming out, you are comparing, I guess, the value of working on survival, so reducing extinction risk and things like it, from AI takeover or anything else, with working on making the future somehow better, given that humanity, makes it out of this century, having survived. And we're making this kind of big if true claim that working on the latter thing could be comparably important to working on survival, maybe even more important. And a lot of that, sounds to me, comes from this thought that by default, without kind of specific interventions, the future conditional on survival will just fall way short of how good it could feasibly be, like 10% or less of the kind of value as you've defined it. That's not intuitive, right? But it's like carrying a lot of weight.
Yeah.
So we should maybe talk about it.
Yeah.
And this is the first part of the series, right? Is this kind of how easy is utopia
right.
to achieve, which now begins to look quite relevant.
Yeah. And let's now actually linger on why it's not intuitive. Because if you just hear the numbers like, 10%, what does that even mean? Maybe it doesn't sound so bad. But the way we're defining quantities of value is in terms of what gambles are better than what other gambles. So if I have a guarantee of achieving 1 unit of value, or a 50-50 chance of achieving 2 units of value or 0 units of value, well, that's how we've defined. Those are equally good, I should say. And they're equally good because that's how we've defined what it means to have 2 units of value. So if I say this future, best feasible future is 100% value, this other future's at 50% value, this other future extinction is at 0 value. Well, what that means is that a 50-50 chance of getting to the 100% valuable future or the 0 value future is as good as the guarantee of getting to a 50% valuable future. And this is the standard way of making meaningful the idea of quantities of value in moral philosophy and economics.
Yeah. Or maybe just to say more or less what you said back.
Yeah.
If it's the case that by default, the future achieves 10% of the value of the best feasible future, that means that a gamble where with 10% likelihood you get the best feasible future and extinction otherwise is, in terms of goodness, neither better than nor worse than prospect of just a guaranteed default future with guaranteed survival. That's like pretty wild and sounds almost fanatical. And
exactly. Yeah. And so there's a couple of clarifications. One is that we're just talking about goodness. Now, if you're the consequentialist, goodness is all that matters. But you might be a non-consequentialist. And so it might be the case you ought not to take the gamble, even though, that's equally good or better. It's also the case that we're also only talking about this kind of long-termist perspective. There are additional moral reasons you might have that are not like long-termist in nature, like partiality to people you know, reciprocity towards people who've benefited you, they'll probably be in the present generation, not in future generations. So we're just focusing on like one aspect of morality. But even so, I think it's pretty wild. And I think it's especially wild once you start cashing out what these different futures kind of actually might look like. And so in particular, we can imagine what we might call a common sense utopia. Okay, imagine a future where we've eliminated all the obvious causes of suffering. There's 100 billion people live in, on Earth and kind of off-world in, habitats circling the solar system. We've sort of restored Earth to close to its like natural environmental kind of ecosystem and beauty. We're having much less of an impact. Everyone is just free to pursue kind of what they want. But the world is, civilization is just limited to our own solar system. And, it may be flawed in other ways that we'll discuss. That intuitively seems like something that's just basically about as good as
that's right.
About as good as you can get. Certainly quite close to the way to a best feasible future. But I think ends up pretty hard to actually have a plausible moral view, at least if you're coming at this from a perspective of trying to do systematic ethics, where it's not the case that actually that future loses out on most possible value. And that is, what we explore in the first major essay called No Easy Utopia.
Right. And that's different from talking about these kind of Brave New World scenarios where there's some kind of dystopian flaw where everyone's somehow deluded or everyone's on drugs or whatever. Like the world you're describing is a world where people know what's up, people are well informed, they're free to choose lives that's good for them and so on. So there's not like there's some kind of secret Black Mirror style flaw. It really is a great a great world for the people inside it.
Yeah, we will talk in a second about different ways in which even that society could involve moral catastrophe. But those ways are not anything as simple as, oh, well, the people aren't really happy. They're actually unhappy in some way.
Yep.
I do think that's a way in which this can be really quite fragile. It's extremely notable that attempts to describe utopia throughout history have systematically failed because they invoke something that seems utopian to the author, but that we now regard as quite dystopian. And even single issues kind of coming in can actually seem quite dystopian. I mean, throughout fiction, utopian fiction, often there's like quite strong totalitarian elements in there.
Mm-hmm.
So like in Brave New World, everyone is engineered to have their role in society.
You said that, and we'll talk about this in more detail, but it's going to look difficult to describe systematically some moral view which regards that common sense utopia you just described as getting kind of close, like, let's say at least half as good or at least 80% as good.
Yeah.
As we've defined value, compared to the best feasible future. And that's like pretty big if true, pretty unintuitive. You could just say, look, I just don't have any way of talking about the numerical value of the future at all. Could I just reasonably say that? What am I giving up if I end up making that move?
You could say it, and there's various reasonable positions one could have that, we aren't able to get into. So we're not claiming to have identified every single issue in ethics.
Yep.
But the underlying thought is just, if you want to be able to make comparisons of goodness between different sorts of gambles and different sorts of sure things, or we call them prospects, because gambling is a bit of a bad framing for it, but instead it's just like, look, I might do something that has an uncertain payoff, I might do something that has a guaranteed payoff, or different sorts of uncertain payoffs. If you want to say that some of those are better than others, and if your judgments obey certain pretty compelling axioms. So one that's I think very compelling is if you think that A is better than B and B is better than C, then you should think that A is better than C. Transitivity. Then it's the case that I can represent all your judgments about which prospects are better than which others as if they have this what's called cardinal value, where you can represent that numerically with quantities of value. And that's all we're saying, in fact. So we're just saying that, we're assuming people's judgments about what things are better than what other things satisfy some fairly compelling axioms.
I mean, it does seem worth mentioning, right? That when we are talking about quantities of value, we're not saying that needs to apply to any reasonable view.
Yeah.
But doesn't take much for a view to be representable as ascribing these quantities. And for to kind of opt out of my view being represented in that way, has to be the case that either I'm violating one of these axioms like transitivity, or completeness, where I just can't, for some pairs of prospects, I just have to throw out my hands and say I'm unable to compare them. But those views are not crazy by any means, right? So worth making that point. Okay, so we're going to be talking about how easy is utopia, and this is presumably relevant because if utopia is easy, you should expect by default the future to be pretty close to as good as it can get.
Yeah, that's right. So, why did I spend so much time working on this? It's because I have the strong intuition that common sense utopia is
likewise.
We also have this term called a mostly great future, which is at least 50% as good as the best feasible future. And the essay is framed in that. And I think, look, intuitively, the common sense utopia is mostly great.
Yeah. Would I take a coin flip between best feasible and extinction, or mostly great?
Yeah.
I feel like I want to say mostly great is really better.
Yeah. So I wanted to see, how well can you, how well does that hold up? And so in the essay, we take two angles into this. The first is a little bit less systematic, but it's making the argument that, well, there are very many ways in which we could make major moral mistakes in the future. That moral mistake, I don't mean that people necessarily have the wrong moral views. They might have the right moral views and just not care. Or they might have the right moral views, but some people might at least, but not be able to implement them. I think there's just many dimensions on which the future can go, including things we don't often pay attention to, such that if we get something, if the future doesn't go right on that dimension, you lose out on most possible value. Then there's a second kind of argument where we much more systematically go through, there's a way of dividing up moral views you could have that is exhaustive, and then going through and saying, okay, the views on which you do have an easy utopia, where by that we mean even if people aren't trying to optimize towards a near best future, they're not. You don't have a large, significant contingent of people really trying to push society towards that. Nonetheless, you'd still get there. That's the view that we call easy utopia. There's only quite a narrow slice of views that seem to be able to support that.
Actually, before we talk about either, there's this metaphor of sailing to an island, which I think nicely kind of breaks up, like, what are the different kind of factors that matter here? So tell me about the island.
Okay, great. So imagine, there's a expedition that's on a sail towards an island. That's the goal. And so you could think that's the goal of like utopia. What are the things in which make it easier or harder, or more or less likely for that ship to kind of reach that goal? Well, it's easier if the island is just closer, easier to observe. There aren't like difficult currents getting you there. That's the idea of kind of easy utopia. Just, you don't have to put in that much work in order to get there.
Not a very long sail to get there.
Yeah. Then there are two other thoughts as well, and that's what we deal with in the second major essay called Convergence and Compromise, where, okay, maybe the island it's far away, it's hard to get to, but the people on the ship are like very competent. They're really trying to get to the island, and so they can skillfully navigate there. A third possibility is that maybe they have many shots on goal. So it's not just one ship that's trying to get to the island, but 100. And as long as just one makes it there, then that counts as success. And so those latter two possibilities involve people in the future trying to deliberately optimize towards a really great future because it's really great. And we talk about those in the second major essay. The first one at the moment is just on this question of whether a utopia is a narrow target or if it's a really big target.
Can you reach the island without trying very hard because it's pretty nearby, it's pretty big, it's pretty easy to see?
Exactly.
That's the current question. And you talk about moral catastrophes. We talk about moral catastrophes. What is a moral catastrophe?
Yeah, so a moral catastrophe is where the world is significantly worse than it would be otherwise because people have made decisions that make, or, omitted to make decisions that have made the world significantly worse. I think one way into thinking about this is just to look at the state of the world today, where let's ask the question, given our level of scientific and technological understanding, how good is the world today, like in 2025, compared to how good it could be, a best feasible 2025? And my claim is that we have squandered essentially all value that we could have achieved. We can look at that even just from the perspective of human well-being, where, there's incredible inequality, incredible extreme poverty. Also just like, in my view, like a gross misuse of resources where most of the stuff we spend money on just isn't very conducive to improving human well-being.
Probably yachts are not the best use of
money,
right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like consumer goods and like often negative sum spending. But then the biggie is how we treat animals, where even looking at like all the progress that we have made on human well-being. So I think for humans today, our lives are much, much better than they were a few hundred years ago on average. But we also factory farm tens of billions of animals, feeding them in like horrible conditions. And that I think is enough to outweigh at least most of that gains, maybe even all of those gains. But it's certainly enough to say that, like, oh yeah, we're really missing out on much of the value we could have achieved.
I mean, you could be uncertain about how much animals suffer, how to kind of weigh them against human lives. But I guess the thought is you should be open to the possibility that the world is much worse.
Yeah.
Maybe it looks even likely.
And here the thought is, that was just one model error.
Mm-hmm.
You could imagine like a souped up version of this world where, okay, extreme poverty is gone, like there's no climate change, there's world peace, everyone works together in harmony, but we're still treating animals in the way that we're treating them. That is enough to get us far away from this best feasible 2025.
I mean, here's a thought. So we're talking about the long run, how good will things just ultimately be? I would say if you ask most people, like, is factory farming good or bad? They're going to say it's bad.
Yeah.
Right? And it's more like, look, there's just not enough time in the day to worry about every problem in the world and change my behavior to avoid causing every possible kind of harm. But maybe we get just enough time to reflect on this stuff. There's enough material abundance that it's actually not much of an imposition at all to, avoid farming animals. You can imagine a world where we just don't have these pretty obvious forms of wrongdoing, like more or less torturing animals on an industrial scale, extreme poverty, even relative poverty compared to the best of today. That's a world where people get what they want. People are basically free to do what they want. Even animals, non-people, could have good lives, right? That feels then harder to imagine how any kind of moral catastrophe could persist. Yeah, am I getting something wrong? Like,
what's the case?
What could go wrong?
Yeah, and in these cases, I actually do think that extreme poverty, as we understand it now, I don't expect to exist in the distant future if we're still around. It's possible that beings will be very poor in the sense of like living at subsistence. I at least expect them to have better lives per moment than people in extreme poverty today. I also don't expect factory farming to persist far into the future, precisely for the reasons you say. But I think there's a lot of dimensions of ethics which are much harder and more subtle than these other issues, and where it just doesn't seem at all clear to me that we get it right by default. So one we can talk about is population ethics. So there are many different views of population ethics, which is the area of ethics that's concerned with evaluating different populations of people. So is a larger population of happy people better?
Yep.
Is it worse? Is it equally as good? And there's various, views that have been developed. It's a notoriously difficult area of ethics. There are various views. The total view, for example, says like, look, you just add up well-being across everyone in the population. The average view says you just look at the average. No one really believes that anymore, but variable value views take some combination generally of average and total well-being. A critical level view says, look at each person's well-being and subtract off a certain amount. It's like they've got a certain amount of debt that they need to repay or something, or there's like a life that comes into existence and then immediately disappears. That would be negative. But then with more well-being, they can become like a positive life. It says add up that across the whole population of well-being minus some shortfall. So there's like many different views, but they have very different implications about what best feasible future would look like. So, total view might say it's an extremely large population of beings with really quite low well-being. And that if you don't have that extremely large population, that's moral catastrophe. Whereas the average or variable value view might say, or even critical level view might say, no, you need a population that's much, much smaller, but with very high well-being. And if you had that really large population with lower well-being per person, that would be a moral catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could look like within a life as well. So perhaps the future involves lots of beings that have high per moment well-being, but are very short. So it might be an AI that gets brought into existence to perform a certain task and then like shut down. Maybe that counts as a full life for that AI. On some population ethical views, that is not only not a great thing, but it's actively very bad. So the critical level view would say that that's like actively negative.
I see. And I take it you're not saying there's some particular view on population ethics, which is the correct view, and here's a reason to think that the future is going to get things wrong by that view. It's more like, look, there are lots of different views you could take. It's really complicated. It's possible that just by default, the world kind of drifts in the right direction by the lights of the correct theory of population ethics. But there's just no reason to think it would, especially.
Exactly.
And that's just a reason to think that the value of the future could then fall very short of how good the future could be. And then just repeat across like many different...
Exactly, yeah. So, and emphasizing again, we'll talk later about whether, in the future, people will figure out what's morally correct and then try and do the morally correct thing. At the moment, we're just asking, does this happen by default?
Right, without people wondering especially about the correct theory of population.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, well, I mean, at best, it's like 50-50, do they get it right? But I think it's actually much lower probability than that they get it right, because there's so many ways in which, you could have a different size of population and well-being of population. And there's no particular reason to think like by default, society will hit on the right population ethics and structure things in accordance with that.
Yep. Okay, so that is population ethics. That's one question where the future could kind of get things wrong and really mess up. Are there other examples of potential moral catastrophes?
Yeah, so I think my argument is that there are lots. There are like many dimensions. So I'll just try and briefly run through them. Where one is just, how we treat AIs, digital beings. Where the worry here is not necessarily that they are suffering and have lives that are worse than nothing, which I think is true for most animals in factory farms. Instead, it's just that they might have considerably worse lives than they could have had. So in just the same way as, even for people in extreme poverty today, I think mostly have lives that are worth living, better than nothing. But they're much worse than they could have been. And that's a moral catastrophe. The same might be true for digital beings. Again, I think this isn't something where there's like a safe option either way, because you could also fail morally by giving AIs and digital beings like too much power, perhaps. And perhaps you end up with this like inhuman alien future in a way that...
It turns out distinctively human values really mattered.
If that's correct, yeah. And then let's just like, I probably won't even remember them all, but like roll through some others of just the happiness-suffering trade-off. We could get that wrong, where it's different moral views differ on whether just a little bit of suffering is enough to outweigh a very large amount of goodness or not. And so if that's true, then maybe a really wonderful future, but just has like a bit of suffering in there or a bit of other sorts of bad things could be much worse than it could have otherwise been. We could get theories of well-being wrong. So in philosophy, the classic theories of well-being are hedonism, which is just that conscious experiences are the only things that are good or bad for someone, pleasure and pain. Objectivist theories where, there are other sorts of objective goods like knowledge and appreciation of beauty and so on, in addition to pleasure and pain. Or preference satisfaction views where, what's good for you is getting what you want. And you could imagine futures where people converge on any of these, but if they get it wrong, then again, we kind of lose out on most.
Yeah. And you could think it's not much of a coincidence that currently these different theories of well-being tend to agree on what they kind of recommend to make people's lives go better.
Yeah.
Because something which had its insane recommendations would not really be like taken up.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it will become increasingly possible to differentiate between the theories. Like, looks very different if you were kind of optimizing for preference satisfaction view versus a hedonic view.
Exactly.
So it really starts to matter like which view you take exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe the future is just these like happiness machines where just these digital beings in utter bliss. That's maybe the best thing from the hedonist perspective.
And like a disaster from most
from most
perspectives. I guess also worth mentioning, take population ethics. As far as I understand, that wasn't really systematically discussed until late 20th century. You could just imagine there are a bunch of questions like these that we haven't properly thought about.
Yeah, I mean, and so I mentioned some of these where, there's the more esoteric end of philosophical thinking, like infinite ethics. Maybe people in the future just do the wrong thing back from whatever is the correct perspective on that.
Yeah.
Or a-causal reasoning or
yeah.
bargaining with simulators. All of this stuff that feels very like out there at the moment. But, maybe there's things that are 10 steps weirder and more difficult than that we haven't even conceptualized yet. And so, yeah, in the essay, we go through a whole bunch of different moral catastrophes, this kind of real long list. And the thought is just, if you miss out on a significant amount of value, or even most value, by getting any one of these wrong, then the probability that you nail it on all of these different dimensions, by default, without future society optimizing towards all of them, becomes very, very low because probability becomes a product. The chance of real success on all of these dimensions.
So the thought is you're doing something like kind of multiplying across these factors.
Yes.
Rather than adding.
Yes, yeah.
So even if you kind of mess up on one, that kind of wipes away the gains from getting all the others right.
Yeah.
Maybe like you could compare to living a good life, right?
Yeah.
Just as a person.
Yeah.
It's like you can have amazing set of friends, amazing relationships. You could like have a great career. But if you suffer from chronic pain, that could just really wipe away like pretty much all your well-being. Or like,
at least most of your well-being. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's something kind of strange with all this, right? Where, earlier we were talking about how it feels intuitively like a really great, kind of almost as good as it can get future. Feels really within reach, right? Like we just got to fix the factory farming stuff, the extreme poverty, this kind of unnecessary suffering. And look, that's not going to happen in decades, but it could happen in centuries. But then you're kind of giving all these reasons, and we'll probably give more reasons why the kind of future that you might vaguely have in mind when you imagine how good things could get in a couple centuries could also just massively fall short. And a lot of the reasons you're giving also sound like, when you consider them individually, kind of intuitively, actually pretty compelling. There's a tension there. What explains why, if you're right, you and I and most people presumably just have totally off intuitions.
So I think there's two things going on. One is just that most people don't have like strong views about these.
Right.
They don't think a lot about.
Yeah, probably you're an outlier in how much you've thought about.
I probably am. About moral philosophy and issues like population. I think so. Like, don't really feel in their gut the moral importance there. I think you can make arguments that at every step mean you really should feel that in your gut. I think that's one thing. But then I think a second that's more direct is just what we described as common sense utopia. Still quite vague, actually. It's still quite underspecified. And what we did was just take things that are just widely agreed as big problems and saying, okay, we've solved all of them. But I would wager that if you're forced to then describe what this world is like in really meticulous, fine-grained detail, and someone is, aiming to do that, so they're designing from their perspective, their best utopian future, and then you give that to someone else in the world, they will probably think that loses most possible value.
Right.
And we talk a little bit about this, just using the world today as an example, where, we think the world today is so much better than it was before. But like most religious views probably think that's not the case, because most religions have dwindled over time. Or, pro-life ethics might not think that, because the number of abortions, 70 million per year, is like extremely high. Environmentalist views, at least strong environmentalist views, might not think that, because environmental destruction has like increased so much. So again, on many different views, you just get one little flaw and you lose out on much possible value.
Yeah, I wonder about a related thing where if you think about making your own life better, there's this, hedonic treadmill people talk about, where it's very easy to have the sort of, if only, I fix this one problem in my life, right? Like, as soon as my injury heals up, or as soon as I get that promotion, or as soon as I like buy the nice car, the final puzzle piece will fall in place and my life will be like about as good as it can get. And then like inevitably you get the nice car and you get the promotion, and then you just like want a nicer car and so on.
Yeah.
And you could imagine that happening at the kind of societal level.
Absolutely.
Right? Where you think, like, if only, we just eliminate this kind of social ill. We get
Yeah.
a new kind of political regime or whatever, and then you
Yeah.
just realize like there's this term first world problems.
Yeah, exactly.
But in like some way, like we're all incumbent with them. And I mean, maybe you could speak to that in terms of historical views of utopia, where they're just like so blinkered.
Well, I was thinking about Nick Bostrom in Deep Utopia talks about the idea of cocaine, which is a medieval conception of utopia. And it's essentially just as many sausages as you want.
Yeah.
Or the big rock candy mountain.
Yeah.
Listen to that song where it's like, fish just leap out of the river and like land at your feet. And we live in that world. Like we live in the world that if you went to most of the, medieval conceptions of, or even the medieval conceptions of utopia, like, whoa, you've got...
and beyond, right? We have these technologies which
which
not even imagined.
Unimaginable, exactly. I was watching a documentary, Human Planet, where one of the things they looked at was a hunter-gatherer group, I think in Brazil, where, the family, the father of the household would climb up this enormous tree out into the branches to stick his hand into beehive, getting stung all the while also risking death, because honey was just the most valuable thing he could possibly have. Like, that was, the best thing in his life, and he was willing to sacrifice so much. I have honey that just sits on,
People fought all these like trade wars over, like nutmeg or spices.
Yeah. I try and actually, as part of kind of appreciation of just what my life is like, often when I open the spice cupboard, I'm like, people went to war over this. 1800s, sugar was 5% of British expenditure. It was like the hot thing. Like, people were willing to like sacrifice a lot, do in fact horrible things for those goods. So we live in that utopia. I don't think we're like, oh, we're now at the best feasible future. Instead, we've just realized how many more problems there are.
Yeah. Although it's worth saying briefly, you might take from that whole story that, look, the kind of road ahead is longer than you might think, right? Because it's kind of, the oasis like recedes when you go towards it.
Yeah.
But still, if it's obvious what problems there are in the world, you can just keep fixing them.
Mm.
And then maybe it takes a very, very long time, but the world's going to keep getting better, and eventually it's going to get, within the ballpark of value of a really best feasible future. And so you could think there's a kind of, optimistic story ultimately. But the thought is that there are certain kinds of moral error where they just never become obvious. They never need to become obvious.
Yes.
They could be present in a world that's very popular.
Yeah, exactly. When we look at moral progress over the last few hundred years, it's very notable how much has come from disenfranchised groups being able to form a coalition and advocate for their own interests. So that's definitely true of women's suffrage, definitely true of civil rights, of LGBTQ plus rights. But then when we look to the future, getting population ethics right, like it's not that the non-existent are going to, the possible people that could have had wonderful lives. They can't form a coalition and advocate for themselves. And I think that's true for many of these other issues too.
We're talking about how easy is utopia, how easy is it to get within the kind of ballpark of value of the best futures. And, you're giving a kind of bunch of reasons around the possibility of moral catastrophe. There's also this more technical argument where we're talking about which moral views make it look easier to kind of get a really great future that kind of captures most of the value. What does it mean for a moral view to be fussy about the future?
Yeah, so fussiness of a moral view is the extent to which that moral view regards only a narrow slice of the futures that we would get if people aren't deliberately optimizing towards a near best future because it's near best. What fraction of them does it think is mostly great, like achieving more than 50% achievable value? It's fussy if it thinks it's only a narrow slice. It's what we call easygoing if it's quite a large slice. And what we do in this second argument is consider different ways in which model views can regard maximum achievable value as a function of resources under civilization. So the simplest view would be total utilitarianism, for example, would very approximately and at large scales just say, if there's twice as much stuff, there's the maximum achievable value that civilization can produce is twice as large, because you can have twice as many flourishing beings. And so let's think about this kind of exhaustively. What are the ways in which different model views could have maximum achievable value vary with amount of resources under civilization? Well, so it could be linear, like the total utilitarian view, or approximately linear. It could be super linear, where it's like, you get exponentially more value the more resources you have. It could be sublinear, but unbounded. So if that maximum achievable value is like the logarithm of resources under civilization, then you could always make things better and better, and better and better without bound by having, just by doubling. Doubling will always increase the amount of value you can achieve by a same fixed amount. Or it can be, and that's sublinear, or it can be sublinear and with an upper bound. On those views, there's a certain amount of value that is just maximally achievable. And you couldn't achieve more value than that, no matter how many resources you have. In the essay, we just basically put to the side two of those possibilities. So the superlinear, because that's like really crazy, really fanatical, just so desperate for more resources. It would say that being able to settle space just a little bit faster maybe is worth paying quite large amounts of extinction risk. And in fact, no one really holds such views.
Economists talk about how, if you duplicated the world, then the world could become more than twice as wealthy because you have twice as much stuff plus the kind of extra like tech progress.
Yes.
Right. Why isn't that kind of relevant?
So because we're talking about very large scales and very large time spans. So it's true that, let's just take the total utilitarian perspective at the moment. At the moment, it's true that if we had twice as much stuff, we could produce more than twice as much value if we wanted to, precisely for this argument, precisely for this reason, that you get information goods like scientific understanding, and other economies of scale. But at very large scales and into the distant future, we won't get that because we'll hit up against technological maturity. So having discovered essentially everything, you might be able to get economies and scale and so on kind of locally. So within one star system or something. But at very large scales, I think it's, at sufficiently large scales, I think it's really quite unlikely that you'll get such economies or diseconomies of scale.
Yeah, another possible confusion is earlier we were talking about, value as a kind of fraction between extinction and best feasible future. That sounds like the kind of framework where value has to be bounded or has to eventually kind of saturate around one. So are you not kind of defining value as being bounded above?
I guess two things. The definition of a best feasible future, we refer to that as 100%. But you could have more than 100%. So if it's a future that's your 99.99999th percentile, then maybe that's 200% value. The point of doing that was just so that we have a meaningful unit. And then the second thought is just, I do broadly assume when I'm thinking about it that, there's just a finite amount of stuff that we can ever reach. Therefore, there's just a finite amount of resources that we can have. And that does mean that all of these views are technically bounded, given the resource constraints that we in fact will face. But many are in principle unbounded. So again, the total utilitarian view just can keep making things better if we were to have more and more and more resources.
It does seem like the simplest view is this linear in resources, unbounded view. Is that view fussy?
All these natural understandings of the view, it's very fussy. So one reason it's fussy is that it means that you need to get future civilization would need to have essentially all the resources it can. Because if future society only settles half of the cosmos, then it can't produce more than 50% much achievable value. So that's one way, just in which it's kind of fussy, is just by sheer scale. That said, I do expect that future civilization to either look like one where we've gone extinct or is very small. Perhaps we choose to stay very small. Or one where essentially just it grows until it can't grow anymore.
Like if it's likely that we kind of spread to the next galaxy, then it's presumably likely that any given galaxy spreads to the next galaxy, and that's all you need for
exactly
this very far-reaching civilization.
Yeah. And just if society has a diversity of groups, then as long as just one group is like expansionary, then society as a whole is expansionary, because then that group just expands and expands and expands. In the same way, when you look at species on Earth, say entering some new environmental niche or something, then they will generally expand until they are using all the kind of resources.
Like most species fail. Most go extinct.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
But still, life spread across the entire Earth.
Yeah, exactly.
So these unbounded linear views, they care about the sheer scale of the future, but you're also saying it's kind of reasonably likely that the future just is
extremely large.
Extremely large. So now it's unclear why they're so fussy.
So then there's the second aspect, which is fussiness about what those resources are used for, where on most kind of linear model views, the very best uses of resources are far better than almost all others. So, there's a truly astronomical number of different ways in which future civilization could use resources. Probably just a small fraction of them, maybe a very, very small fraction, are producing close to the kind of largest amount of value over cost, like value per unit of resources. So let's just take the kind of classical utilitarian view, just as the simplest view. So classical utilitarianism is total utilitarianism plus hedonism. So what it's wanting to do is just maximize the amount of positive conscious experience. Well, there's so many experiences, even once a future is just focusing on producing conscious experiences, let's say. Even within that, I think there's probably a very large number of different types and dimensions of experience, and then a very large, even within one kind of type, very many different experiences. And probably the best of them are just way better than merely okay ones. So this seems to be true within human experience, where there's I think it's true just you reflect on your own experiences. It's true, it seems to be vindicated by some preliminary studies where people regard their kind of most intense or most enjoyable or least enjoyable experiences as a lot more enjoyable or unenjoyable than even their second most.
Right, okay. So you might
let alone
want to
most
trade
of them.
Like days of somewhat nice living for some seconds or minutes of these very best peak experiences.
Yes, exactly. And in the essay we have some quotes from Dostoevsky and Bertrand Russell where they explicitly make these claims too. And then there's just different ways in which experiences could be implemented too. So is the best future on classical utilitarianism with these like tiny little brains implementing, having very happy lives? Or is it these galaxy-sized brains having like very happy lives? What's the architecture? What's the substrate? Like there's all of these different dimensions. And if that kind of distribution of value over the cost is even just a bit kind of heavy-tailed, which I think is likely, then most of that stuff is probably just low. And
here's one way of saying that back, and you can tell me if I'm getting it right. We're going to talk about views which are bounded, right? They have some cap where you just need to reach that bound, and then you've pretty much done as well as you can do.
Yeah.
You can compensate on those views for getting the details wrong with scale, just with enough good stuff on some other dimension. The reason that these unbounded linear views are so fussy and require getting everything right is because the best feasible future, the
Yeah.
ceiling, is just the world where presumably pretty much everything goes right. So it's
Yeah, exactly.
enormous in scale, and all the details are being nailed. So it's much less forgiving. There's no kind of wiggle room, and that's why you need to get everything.
Yeah, exactly. So the best possible future on, classical utilitarianism would be, of all the different possible brains or computational processes that produce good experiences, found exactly the best one, and it's just loads of that.
Yeah,
as much as you can. And
yeah.
yeah,
Gotta say, it's not an appealing vision of the future. It's a view, right?
I actually have work in progress with Christian Tarsney on a theory of population ethics that incorporates the value of variety, precisely because this intuition of this best possible future being completely homogenous, where you've just figured out the best life and it's just replicas of that life, across the galaxy, across the cosmos. Yeah, it's not like the most appealing thing.
It almost begins to feel like something is wrong and feels
for sure. I mean, there's definitely but it's actually interesting. Like, this is an all now digression because it's not in the piece, but every single extant, published theory of population ethics, actually, well, with one exception, but all the major ones, they all have that implication. And putting aside, person affecting views, but impartial views, they all have that implication that a best possible future is this homogenous future.
Yep.
And so we develop a theory of population ethics that doesn't have that.
Okay. So those are unbounded views, which look very fussy. You might instead think that the right way of thinking about the goodness of the future has some kind of bound. So, you described this common sense utopia earlier.
Yeah.
I might think that, that's pretty close to as good as things can get.
Yeah.
Maybe it's really actually there already.
Mm.
And you can make more of it. You can kind of go to the next solar system or whatever and build some more nice stuff. But that doesn't make the world overall more valuable. Because I just kind of stopped caring at some point about more and more stuff.
I think on the most plausible bounded views, so again, this is where you've got maximum achievable value of resources. The curve just goes up, and then it tends to sum up a bound, but doesn't reach it. So it's always the case that you prefer having the additional star system with another wonderful utopia. You just care less and less and less and less and less. So the first one is go from 0 value to 90% of value. But by the time you've got 100, then you're at 99.99%, and you add on an extra 0.9%. But it's a small difference.
So I'll say that I find this intuitive. It's worth putting in a word for the linear views, where they do at least have this kind of separability built into them, where you don't need to know about the rest of the world to know what you're contributing in your kind of local area. I don't know if you want to say more about.
Yeah, sure. So the idea of separability, again, a concept from economics and moral philosophy, is in some way at least, a view as separable. So in this case, we're talking about separability with respect to resources, at least at large enough scales, where you can just say, okay, here's a chunk of resources, the value of this. Here's a chunk that's different, value of this. And you can just add them up over time. Add them up space of time, But you're adding up the value, and the overall value is the sum total. Here's an argument for thinking that separability is really quite plausible, is I'm thinking about okay, do we want a future that goes like this or the future that goes like this? I don't then think, man, how good or bad was Egyptian civilization? Or how good or bad are the value of alien civilization? Seems just irrelevant to the decision that we're making, which is just about, the future of our civilization. However, if you got these views that are non-separable, which is true for all the non-linear views that we talked about.
I guess I'll say it's not just a nice feature of summing over different parts of the world, but summing over different parts of the world is uniquely the function which is separable, other than the kind of trivial
Yes.
constant.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas all these other views, they do care. Because maybe the Egyptians had this amazing civilization, in which case you're then like close to this upper bound of value and you want to be super, super like loss averse because things can go down. Value can decrease a lot, but it can't go up a lot. Or maybe they have like, a really bad civilization in the past, in which case you're really far from the upper bound. Or similarly with aliens.
You got to bite that bullet, but let's say that you do. You take this bounded view. Really does seem to me like great futures, near best futures look a lot easier, a lot more achievable, a lot more likely on those views. Is that right, or are there complications?
There are complications. I mentioned like sublinear but non-bounded views. We don't talk about these just because I think they're strictly less plausible than the views where maximum achievable value is diminishing resources, but up to an upper bound. Because those sublinear views are still fanatical. They still think, at least if the amount of resources are big enough, you should still take these tiny probabilities of enormous upside. So yeah, I think we can put them to the side. Okay, let's just think about the views with an upper bound. The most natural way of doing that, I think straightforwardly ends up being fussy, because it ends up being approximately linear in practice. And that's because the view would say, look at the value of the universe as a whole. That value is diminishing in resources up to an upper bound. But the universe is really big, possibly infinite.
Yeah, we'll put a citation for that claim.
Yeah, exactly. But even if it's not infinite, then it's like a lot bigger even just than our observable universe. And so that means there will be many, many alien civilizations. Some of them will be good.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some are bad. But either way, it means that the total value, the amount by which we're changing the total value of the universe, with whatever we do, even with like all of the cosmos that we could access, it's very, very small compared to the value of the universe as a whole. And if you've got this strictly concave function of value over resources, then you're making just a tiny, tiny change. Well, any concave function is locally linear. Yeah, any difference you make, or humanity makes, will be approximately a linear difference in the value of...
Two common sense utopias really is twice as good.
Yeah, exactly.
To a tiny kind of error bar.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we're operating on this tiny scale relative to the
universe as a whole. Exactly. So that means you can't use the most natural way of specifying the kind of bounded value view.
Or you can, but it just ends up looking like
you can, but then it's fussy.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so then what about if you just look at the difference in value that humanity makes? Or perhaps just the forward-looking difference in value. Okay, great. Now we can forget about all the aliens because they're not affecting the difference in value. We're thinking like that value is bounded above. And that's in fact, and the claim in the view is like, that's the thing that we should care about. There are major problems for such views. So I have a paper with Hilary Graves and Terry Thomas on this difference-making views. Yeah, they've got some like real issues that I think we won't be able to get into, but even assuming we go with it. Okay, it still needs to be the case that the upper bound is like low enough that it's like meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
It could still in principle be like so high that, again, we're still locally linear. But okay, but assume it's now like close enough. Perhaps that, we're getting the intuition that like common sense utopia is like more than 50% as good as the best future. Okay, there's still a different way in which it could be fussy, which depends on how the view aggregates goods and bads. One way is to just have a kind of bound applied to all the goods. You have a bound applied to all of the bads. On this value now, though.
Yep.
And then add them both together. If that's the case, though, then given that future civilization will be very, very large indeed, the views end up being basically obsessively concerned with even like tiny, tiny amounts, like fractions of bad in the future. So let's say the goods and bads are happiness and suffering. And let's say that common sense utopia is correct. So just, one fairly small, by cosmic standards, a society, just around our sun, gets you more than 50% of the way. But then let's imagine a civilization completely spread out across the stars, but where has one part in 10 to the 22 is suffering. 10 to the 22 is suffering rather than happiness. So it's a very small number. So for reference, that's like, imagine the whole world economy. Imagine all of the money in the world today is spent on just maximum happiness. But 1/1000th of a penny is spent on suffering instead. That would be enough on these views to mean that we don't have a mostly great future. And in fact, could end up like close to zero.
These are views which are bounded above but not bounded below, or also bounded below?
Even if the views are bounded above and below, but you're aggregating the goods and the bads separately. Because the thought is like, okay, civilization gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, okay, you very quickly get very close to the upper bound on goods. It's getting bigger and bigger. You've got this little bit of bad, a little bit of bad. But that adds up and adds up and adds up and gets quite high, close to the bound of bads too. And then even if you're treating goods and bads symmetrically, you think there's a similar amount at stake, add them together, you get like zero. And in fact, it's worse than this because intuitively, and we're doing this view because we've got the common sense moral intuitions. Intuitively, things can get much worse than they can get good. Like if you tell me how much worse is like 2 galaxies of suffering compared to 1 galaxy of suffering, personally, I think it's twice as bad. But it's certainly not like, oh, well, we've already got 1 trillion galaxies of suffering, so another one is not so bad. Like, no, it's still really bad. So it's more plausible that either the bound is much larger in magnitude than the upper bound, or that, in fact, like bads are unbounded. And if so, then it's like, even that thought of, well, 1/1000th of a penny being spent could be way, way smaller than that.
In which case, a kind of a big future or a future when we survive
extraordinarily
seems near guaranteed to be very, very bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe a way of saying some of that back is, you imagine there's kind of bounds below and above. And you imagine what happens when you approach both.
Yeah.
Because you're aggregating separately.
Yeah.
Then how do they compensate for one another?
Yeah.
And if they compensate for one another such that the result is at all better than extinction, or just equivalent to extinction, then take let's say a galaxy that has a tiny bit of happiness, but just enough to approach the bound, and a huge amount of suffering.
Yeah.
So that does not seem better than extinction.
Yeah.
And then furthermore, you can ask, should you create another one of those terrible galaxies?
Yeah.
And this view would recommend creating it. So the bound below's got to be lower or unbounded. But then it looks really so is there any way that a bounded view can be not fuzzy at all, or are we just doomed?
Yeah, so I think there is. And also, interject for the listener that we're really giving it a go on in podcast form, talking about some really quite technical topics.
Maybe we'll try to put some
hopefully we can
graphs on the screen.
We can put some graphs, but if you're finding this a bit confusing or hard going, that's just because it is objectively. Not confusing, hopefully, but
well,
it's like this is in the weeds, stuff. But yes, there is. So instead, suppose that we aggregate goods and bads jointly. So then it's okay. Like we've got, close to the upper bound and the good stuff, a bit of bads. Well, that just takes us a little further away from the upper bound. So what we're doing is just taking all of the goods and bads, happiness and suffering, let's say, adding it all up, and then applying some sort of bounded function to that. So then that doesn't have the problem of just obsessiveness about small amounts of bads. This view, I think, is easygoing. So I think at this point, it's like, now we found what we were trying to find, which is like an easygoing moral view. And at this point, it's just then, okay, well, taking stock, should we just think, okay, this is the view that we think is most likely? Yeah. And I think there's a couple of reasons to think no. One is that, well, it's just really quite a narrow slice of views now. And unless you're coming in very morally confident, probably seems right to instead kind of spread your credences across different views. And then the second is just, we had to make certain choices that I think have like quite major issues. So this idea of difference making, boundedness rather than boundedness for the universe as a whole, that violates a property that's called stochastic dominance, where basically you might want to choose A rather than B on this view, even though B, for whatever value of the universe might have, B makes it more likely that you get to that value of the universe. Check out the paper.
Sounds right.
Better not linger on stochastic dominance. But actually, that gets discussed in this other paper, though, on difference-making views. Then also, I think that aggregating goods and bads jointly, it's less clear, but it's probably also not the right way to go.
Okay. I mean, one thing you can add is presumably you should be uncertain between these different approaches to valuing the future. And then there's this question of what happens when you try to kind of take into account that uncertainty.
Yes. And then I think if you do that, if anything, that ends up favoring the views that are more kind of linear, where this again kind of gets quite technical. You can get into the weeds of like, how do you think about comparing kind of how high the stakes are across these different model views?
Yep.
But the linear views, I think there is just generally more at stake on the upside, at least, on like how good things could be. And that means, already it was the case that I think you should spread your credences across these different views. So probably your credence in the view that is easygoing should be relatively low. But not only that, I think that view where the most natural way of understanding things is such that if kind of the correct model view or ethics is easygoing, things are also probably just a bit less high stakes than they are if it's not.
I see. I guess it's also worth saying, if we're considering options where there's some chance of a bad outcome, right? And some views are going to be really sensitive to downside. And even if you're considering a view which is kind of bounded at both above and below, if you're just open to the possibility that downside is not bounded.
Or has a lower bound that's very low.
Right. Then kind of in aggregate, you're going to end up being really sensitive about avoiding these extremely bad futures.
Yes.
Which is importantly different from the view which says, look, the main thing that matters is this kind of max epoch. Maximize the chance that you have a kind of okay future, or somewhat equivalently, minimize extinction risk or minimize the chance of getting a near zero value world. That actually does not look like on any kind of reasonable approach to moral uncertainty, like the kind of view that falls out.
Yeah, which is pretty interesting. So even take this easygoing moral view, and let's say it is respecting the intuitions where you think bads can get quite a lot worse than goods. Then that view is plausibly like just not in favor of reducing extinction risk. It's very suffering focused. And so, it does actually become remarkably hard to find a view that thinks that, reducing the probability mass on approximately zero value futures is the most important thing, rather than views that are either focused on ensuring we get the upside or views on ensuring we miss don't get the downside. And both of those are in the flourishing category of surviving category.
And I guess those views also care about, for interventions which mostly, influence or are designed to influence the kind of chance of survival, they're really going to be looking to what they do in the worlds where, we do survive. And that's going to be the important effect of those
exactly.
survival-focused interventions, which is kind of weird. We take stock.
Yes. Yeah.
We're kind of straining the podcast format, right? So, we can like link to the actual paper with graphs and whatnot. But the question here was, how easy is a near best future? How easy is it to get most of the way on this kind of flourishing axis? You can talk about the possibility of a moral catastrophe that extends into the future because it's just not obvious to people who are living in a future. Even if the future is very popular, people are very happy, free to do what they want. And then kind of more in the weeds, more technical, there's this discussion of different moral views, different ways of valuing the future. And some of those views are kind of easygoing. They make it look relatively easy to get a near best future, but they look kind of much narrower, much more fragile than you might have thought going into this. That's a reasonable.
That's a pretty good summary.
So that's kind of part of this question of I guess, how likely is it, all things
Mhm.
considered,
Yeah.
that we get a near best future? But it's not all of it, because there's this extra question, I guess, around whether people actually begin to care and begin to get things right
Yeah.
and really try to actively kind of move towards best futures. Yeah, how do you think about that set of questions?
Okay, yeah. So again, going back to the island analogy,
Yeah.
okay, the narrow target, the island, it's included broadly, it's like far away, it's hard to reach. But yeah, maybe there's like one of two ways in which we get saved. One is like the ship in general just goes straight toward, hits that target, competently navigates towards it. Or perhaps they're just many shots and goal. They're many ships and one of them succeeds and that's enough. And so that maps onto the two main issues that, we focus in this next big essay, Convergence and Compromise, where the first idea is maybe there's widespread model convergence that's accurate, so it actually gets to like the right model views, and it's also motivating. Because you could imagine a world where it's like, people are like, oh yeah, that's the right thing to do, but I prefer to do my own thing.
I agree that factory farming is terrible. Like,
Still eat meat.
I'm waiting for
Quite
my burger. Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing I'll say, and like this becomes especially important here, is just, I naturally use a lot of realist language and like realist sympathetic, so on.
Mm-hmm. Moral
But
realist.
Moral realist, yeah. Where that means, I think there is just some correct model view. Unclear how you cash that out exactly. But I think all of this discussion, you can just translate between that and into your favored kind of anti-realist language, where instead what we're talking about is the values you would have upon idealized reflection, something like that.
Stuff you care about, right? Like
Stuff you
nihilism
care
is not
about.
the alternative to
Yeah, exactly. And so, so then the question is just, okay, do we get that widespread, accurate motivational convergence? Or if not, do we get, and that's, the first part is addressing that. Second part is, if not, then do we get partial, accurate and motivational convergence? And then compromise and trade between different groups who want different things, such that the people who do have the right model views, want to promote the good, make things good as possible, whatever that consists in, they are able to get most of what they value because other people are able to get most of what they value as well via certain sorts of like trades.
I see. So, last section talking about how easy is it to get great future without, a bunch of people really actively trying. Now the question is it likely that a bunch of people really actively try in just the right way? And then what if only some people try?
Yeah.
This kind of thing. Okay, so there's this question of whether people in the future, converge on caring about the right stuff and trying to actually, make the future better. But there's also this question of whether those people are kind of motivated to just do the right thing or make futures better per se, or whether they just, happen to care about things that are good. Yeah, can you say more about that distinction?
Oh, yeah. So, in philosophy world, there's this jargon called de dicto, de re. But the thought is, someone might be motivated to do good things, but not because they're good, just because they care about their friends or they care about extreme poverty or something. Caring about doing good de dicto, I think it's rarer, but that's where you're at least in part aiming to do something because it's good to do, such that if you had arguments to think, oh, well, this actually isn't the best thing, something else is best instead, then you would switch and you would do that other thing that's best. And because the near best future is this narrow target, I think if we have, motivational convergence, that de dicto form that we'll need, where think about the list of model catastrophes, we'll need people who are able to, are motivated to figure out what is correct on each of these issues, change their behavior on that basis, and then promote what's best or do what's best because it's good.
Right. There are all these questions we don't know the answer to. If you just pick an answer on every question and just go for that,
yeah, exactly,
kind of rigidly and inflexibly, you're probably going to mess up. So you need this kind of
coincidence,
higher level motivation to get things right.
Yeah, exactly.
that makes sense. And then the question is just how likely it is that people end up caring about the
Yeah, that's right.
good dedicto. And also there's this thought of people's moral circle expanding to kind of get closer to this more abstract concern for the good in general, helping people in general. If you extrapolate that, that sounds like good news on this front. How confident should we be based on those kind of arguments from history?
I think like when you really dig into them, they're not terribly strong arguments for being really optimistic into the future. Okay, let's take for granted that we've had this wave of moral progress. I think it's like less clear once again you start, really digging into it and thinking about, well, what are the ways in which things could have gone better that we don't pay much, as much attention to, like attitudes to animals. What explains that kind of wave of moral progress? Well, it could be that there was just this one big wave towards kind of liberal democracy, and that's good. But there could have easily been waves towards other things, like Confucian values, or a wave towards kind of fascist authoritarianism, if the USSR or the Nazis had, gained more power in the 20th century. You might think, okay, already that seems like a little contingent. You might also think that it's a driver there is a genuine driver of progress, but one that like won't necessarily occur kind of into the future. So we mentioned earlier the idea that quite a lot of this progress seems to have come from disenfranchised groups being able to kind of rally together and advocate for their own interests. But when we look at these challenges into the future, it doesn't really seem that we get that same dynamic with population ethics, or indeed with digital beings whose preferences we have chosen and engineered.
Yep.
In fact, the digital beings could be having horrible lives, and they would say that they have wonderful lives. And then it could also be that there's a driver that is locally good, has been good for the next few hundred years, but won't continue into the future, where we've gotten more liberal, we've gotten more egalitarian. Because at this particular point of time, technologically speaking, it's very economically useful for a society to have more, egalitarian dispersion of resources, more political power from like many people and so on.
To be clear, you're not saying these things are bad, right? We should be
No, I'm saying they're good. Yeah, exactly.
But we got lucky. Like to some extent, these were economic circumstances that enabled or even caused
exactly,
not people with arguments.
Yes, exactly. In a way that might not hold post AGI, where in that world, humans are no longer adding very much value. Liberal democratic society like the United States, partly powerful because it gives, educates a large fraction of the workforce and is open to like many different ideas, many people who can innovate and so on. But post AGI, humans aren't providing any value economically or militarily. And so perhaps those underlying mechanisms fade away. And I'm not really committing to any particular explanation. I mean, we have only one history, so it's hard to know.
Yeah.
But it's just at least saying like, it's at least very non-obvious that what has happened has been kind of a march of moral progress and reason.
We're also presumably imagining a world with very powerful AI, like you said, right?
Yeah.
Kind of AI that you could go and ask for answers to these thorny moral questions. Why not just ask the AI?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think here the question is like, what questions will the people ask and what will they be motivated to act on? So, the AI might help me evaluate what are my reflective values. There's no guarantee from the argument that we've now got AI that will be the same as your reflective values, therefore that we'll get convergence. And then secondly, even if, let's say there is some kind of moral fact of the matter, then the AI is saying, oh, well, XYZ is actually like what's best to do. I might just not care. I might want to act in my own self-interest. Or instead, I might just have some moral commitment I'm unwilling to give up, where, this is maybe most obvious if I'm a fundamentalist, like religious believer. I might just say like, yeah, cool, provide me advice, but obviously it's all conditional on this holy book being correct. I think the same could be true for just other sorts of moral commitments we have, like non-religious cases where people could act, be interested in reflecting to some degree getting AI advice with the starting premise of environmentalism or utilitarianism or whatever else, and therefore don't end up even having the kind of right moral views, let alone being motivated to act on them.
I suppose I could also look around and see what the AIs are saying, when they're asked to give their kind of unconstrained opinion about what's best. And maybe it looks very alien or unappealing.
Yeah.
I could just choose not to
exactly.
go along with that, right?
Yeah. Or I could just be not very interested in reflecting at all, or just not have time. So I think a lot of the big challenges we're going to have to make, or big choices, the ones with really path-dependent effects, many of them, if some sort of intelligence explosion comes soon, then many of them happen like in the years following that. That's really not very much time, and not necessarily at all enough time for people to want to have an AI that simulates them, to figure out what their reflective preferences are, and then act on that basis, let alone to go through the process of reflection themselves. And so it really seems quite likely to me that these decisions get made significantly on the basis of just unreflective preferences that people have now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another optimistic story where, values in the future become nicer, or at least more altruistic, pointing towards these kind of great futures, is we presumably should be imagining a more materially abundant world. And different preferences kind of saturate slower or faster with more material resources. And in particular, the kinds of preferences that you might expect to saturate very slowly because they're maybe roughly kind of linear with certain resources, like money, are altruistic preferences. Because there's lots of people in the world, so it's like you don't really run out of ways of helping the next person nearly as quickly as you run out of ways of improving your own life. And so if everyone becomes wealthy, you can imagine that those kind of seeds of impartial concern kind of grow to become more and more relevant over time. And so the future is one where everyone kind of cares about how things are going, broadly construed, because they just run out of like ways to buy another super yacht or whatever. Yeah, doesn't that make you more hopeful?
So I think that is an argument for some amount more hope. So again, the thought is just people get extremely rich, so everyone's a trillionaire. They now have satisfied all of their self-interested wants and needs. Maybe they've just got a bit of moral concern. Well, in which case then they start shifting their resource use onto the kind of moral stuff. So I think there's a bunch to say there. One thought is like, it's not totally obvious that at the crucial point in time, people are extremely rich. There's some arguments like, if the decisions are made further in the future, over time, just wages go down to subsistence as populations grow.
I guess you could think that the wealthiest people are also the people with
the most power,
influence over the future, for better or worse.
But then, there's other arguments here too. So one is just that this isn't an argument at all for thinking that there'll be moral convergence between different people. So even if everyone starts acting on their kind of moral preferences, well, you might still just have the same kind of ideological conflict. Mm-hmm. And maybe even now it's like environmentalism 1 and environmentalism 2, like radically different views when, people are really trying to optimize towards them. So they maybe increase the amount by which people are spending on ideological preferences, but not necessarily self-interest preferences.
Yep.
A second thought is just, well, at this scale, people might just be acting on approximately like linear or like non-diminishing self-interested preferences as well. People want more star systems.
More effigies.
More like huge works of art that they like find beautiful. It's obviously hard to know, but one piece of evidence here would be looking at what happens with increases in wealth in the world today. People's wealth varies over many orders of magnitude in the world today. But the correlation between that and the portion of income or wealth that's given is very, very unclear. Like maybe it's even negative, where poorer people give a larger fraction of their income. And even if you look at the kind of billionaire class, I mean, honestly, it is just kind of astonishing to me.
It is, yeah.
That billionaires don't give more money. These aren't numbers that, we're confident of, but it looks like if you're including saving, then billionaires as a whole give about 5% of their income, which is mainly like returns on their wealth. If you're not including saving, though I don't see why you wouldn't, then it does get higher, more like 20% or something.
Mhm.
This is, you would think if this argument were correct, that would be way higher, because we're in a world where you cannot buy, like once you're a billionaire, like what can you buy to further your own self-interest? Like basically nothing, just maxed out. That's different to this like future world we're thinking about, where you now have
Right.
all possible technological goods
Yeah.
that you could be purchasing, including I can
Products.
extend my life as
Right.
far into the future as I want. I can have many copies of myself as I want. So yeah, there's a lot more self-interested goods too.
People can disagree today about exactly what things they care about, what kinds of worlds, what kinds of futures they think would be really great. But the problems in the world today are so obvious.
Yeah.
They kind of stand in the way of such a wide range of things that you might care about, like just disease, poverty. We can all agree broadly on kind of what to do.
Yeah.
From a impartial view. If you're imagining this kind of materially abundant world, which has fewer of these really salient
Yes, absolutely.
problems, then that kind of reveals the like latent disagreement that was always there, which is, look, now we're kind of running out of these points of agreement.
I'm seeing kind of 2 points there. One is related to this, okay, future abundance world, compare with billionaires today. So billionaires today don't have much good stuff to spend on for their own self-interest. They also have people living on $2 a day. Extremely salient problems. I'm not expecting that in this future scenario. Those easy, low-hanging fruit of problems to solve in the world.
Easy,
Yeah. Comparatively easy. Have been largely addressed. So there's perhaps even less motivation there. But then the second thing is relating to, convergence and appearance of convergence over time, where if it's the case that to have true convergence, we need to have basically the same views on all of 10 dimensions, let's say. And we've been agreeing on like the first 4 and converging in the first 4. Well, it doesn't really tell you you'll converge on the final 2 either. So yeah, perhaps there's just lots of things that they're good from a wide variety of perspectives, moral perspectives, especially if they involve just like generally empowering the world, because we're in a world where we can't do very specific optimized things. We can't create bliss machines. We can't create these very specific scenarios.
Or we can, but they're just like such a less
They suck. Yeah,
effective
exactly.
thing to do than the obvious problems.
Yeah, exactly. Like making people richer and happier and healthier in a way, and more educated in a way that like has benefits for such a wide range.
I mean, one distinction is whether you are a moral realist or not. You might think, look, at least if you're a realist, you think there's some objective, mind-independent fact of the matter about which futures are best. That would kind of be a very natural, gravitational well for people to fall in. Doesn't convergence look at least likely on realism?
Yeah, divide up into moral realism, some fact of the matter for people to converge onto, or anti-realism, it's just people's own starting preferences and thoughts about how to adapt those preferences. I think there's a bit of a dilemma where if you've got the anti-realist view, then you should expect people to be more likely to be motivated to act on the views they ultimately come to, but less likely to converge. In the realist case, you should expect it's more likely for people to converge on beliefs about what is correct, but less likely to be motivated because, what is morally correct might be further away, or is likely to be like further away from what my preferences in fact are. So, Peter Singer might lecture people on, well, this is the morally correct thing. You want to give money to charity. And lots of people are like, oh yeah, I see that that's morally correct. And I'm not motivated to act on it.
Mm-hmm.
If moral realism is true, then probably the correct view is like much more distant from the preferences of people today, or even human preferences. And that, it seems to me, makes it less likely that, people will come to those beliefs and be motivated to act on them. There is a view within metaethics called internalist moral realism, where on this view, simply by coming to believe that something is morally correct, you are thereby motivated to act.
What it means to hold a moral view.
Exactly, yeah. But then if that's true, then people might well just choose not to have those, choose to never form those beliefs. And in fact, there's even some experimental evidence on people today will deliberately not try to find out some model information because then they will have preferences that are different than the preferences they have today and will make them worse off.
Okay. What about anti-realism? I mean, you might think actually that the anti-realist could be more optimistic because, as you say, they don't need to imagine that the futures they care about have to be totally alien to their existing preferences. They're kind of allowed, maybe to value futures kind of closer to home. Is there a case for pessimism on anti-realist views as well?
Yeah, I mean, here it's more pessimistic on convergence. So, we talked about how the target is like narrow, really very narrow, I think. And so even with like shared human preferences and people, even in the mode of thinking people care broadly about similar things, which I generally think is somewhat overstated because people primarily care about themselves. And then for the reasons we've discussed, some of the seeming agreement can actually like mask deeper disagreement because we might all like the world to be richer, but for many different reasons. But it seems to me like these shared human preferences are just really quite underpowered for getting to a view that's similar enough that everyone like focused on the same target, where there are just many free parameters in ethics. Mm-hmm. So even if you take two people that have converged all the way to classical utilitarianism, well, they still can wildly disagree on what the value of different experiences. Because on this anti-realist view, there's nothing in the experiences themselves that are telling you how valuable those experiences are. Like that would be a realist view in my understanding. So instead, it's just about what experiences do I like and what do I not like.
Maybe subject to some process of, reflection or idealization.
Right, exactly.
But even given that.
But if there's this astronomically large number of kind of different experiences, and the classical utilitarian is saying it's just, well, this one best experience as much as possible, it seems really quite likely they'll end up with different choices there. And again, if you think that the distribution of value over cost is heavy-tailed, they will think that this like other choice is just losing out on like much of like most value that could have been chosen.
Okay. These are reasons to be pessimistic about the kind of very widespread motivational moral convergence, accurate convergence that you need to hit this narrow target. But still, maybe some people care about, bringing about the best kind of future. And those people could trade.
Yeah.
Tell me about moral trade.
Okay, terrific. So, here's the thought of, I come away feeling fairly skeptical about the idea that the world as a whole just converges onto the right views. But potentially there's huge gains from trade among people who do have those views and don't, where consider just people who are just, after their self-interest largely, and people who have some cosmic scale view. Well, people who are after the self-interest probably get most of what they want from what cosmic standards are like a quite small fraction of resources. So it's just the galaxy or something. People outside of that, the kind of classical utilitarians or other cosmic scale preference people could get everything outside of that. And perhaps both parties then get like more than 99.9% of what they would want. That's a very kind of optimistic story.
I think the idea of moral trade itself is really cool and maybe underappreciated. It's often cheaper to make an agreement with someone else to kind of mutually change our behaviors or to pay someone than to just keep changing your behavior, right? There's a point at which you can't recycle anymore. But then, you can always encourage more recycling and so on. There's a question of how kind of closer trade gets you to a near best future if you only control, some small fraction of all the resources. But it's possible to trade with other groups. I know how you think about, the circumstances in which trade really does get you kind of over the hump.
The way I think about it is in terms of, again, these different sorts of model views and how they value resources. So it could be linear, could have a upper bound. So suppose that the right model view is linear in achievable value with resources, and other views are held in society have a upper bound or are diminishing. That looks really good because while all the views that are diminishing in resources can get satisfied with just a bit of all the sources, and perhaps they value things in that the linear view doesn't value, like being close in space and time, for example, or having rocky habitable planets. If there are many other views that are linear in resources other than the correct view, it's possible in principle to get trade. So let's say you've got the hedonistic total utilitarian and the preference satisfactionist total utilitarian. In principle, they could have hybrid good, which is, a being that has amazingly positive experiences, but also is getting its preferences maximally filled. That is in principle possible, but I think it's fairly unlikely, probably, because again, if you're just picking out, if each view just has this like little narrow target that it thinks it's best and has this heavy-tailed distribution of value, then it would just be quite unlikely for there to be some best thing, which is like, let's say they each have 50% of resources. It would need to be at least 50% as good as the best thing in order on both views for the trade to make sense, to create that kind of hybrid.
Instead of just taking your half of the resources and fully optimizing them.
Exactly, yeah. So, yeah, I think it's like fairly unlikely that we would get trades of that form. But then there's also the view that, maybe the right model view is diminishing in resources or has a upper bound above. And there, again, it looks like way easier that we'll get there. Maybe we don't even need trade. It's just that a small fraction of society really cares about that thing and is able to, with that small fraction of resources they have, still get us kind of close to the upper bound of how good things could be. But then trade makes that even more likely. In that circumstance, though, I start to worry about threats, which are kind of the evil twin of trade.
Yeah.
Where threats or blackmail, extortion get quite a bit, I think, more worrying in a post-AGI world, where, especially when we're concerned with moral goods, where if I want, let's say I just want stuff for myself, you're a utilitarian, then if I can credibly commit to reducing a huge amount of suffering, unless you give me some of your resources, then, I can just do that. And then it is now, in fact, the best thing for you to do to give me some of your resources. Unless you've already committed to not negotiate with terrorists or not negotiate with people who are trying to blackmail. This is a whole important area that, I'm not really that familiar with, at least in the details. The people at Center for Long-Term Risks who work on suffering risks, focused on it much more. But they often warn that you can make things worse even by learning about them. There's a bit of a rough area. But if you do have this view that, value is bounded above and has a very low bound below, or is just linear with bads, then even just a little bit of executed threats, again, means that you lose out on most value or even have a net negative future.
So it's already possible for me to go around threatening people. You said that threats are more worrying in the future. Is that because it's easier to make credible threats with AI or something else?
Well, I think there's two things. One is that it does seem like AI will allow you to make more credible threats. So if, I've just entrusted my resources to an AI, that AI may have transparent motivation, even verifiably transparent motivation. And you can just see, it has a utility function such that the thing it most wants to do is produce suffering unless Finn gives the AI resources. that's one thing. And then secondly is when it comes to moral trade, I think this becomes kind of more significant, where if I'm just concerned with, my own well-being and you're concerned with your own well-being, well, then if I'm threatening you, it's like, well, I can threaten you with torture or beating you up or something. But those are like relatively easy to kind of block. It's clear that I wouldn't have like wanted to do that otherwise. Whereas, let's say you have a critical level population ethics. And I'm a totally, I say, oh, well, I want to create all of these like short-lived beings with very happy lives. And you're like, that's outrageous. That's of negative value from my perspective. It becomes a lot less clear. Is that just a legitimate moral preference of mine? Or is that something I've like a plan that I've concluded on because it's a way to get more resources from you?
Yeah, how do you put all that together? There's some possibility of threats. Trade seems promising, although the worlds where trade is most likely and enabled, maybe that's also a case where threats are easiest. How does it all net out in terms of, hopes for a near best future when only some people are, motivated by the kind of abstract desire to make the future best?
So, I think it nets out in, being notably more optimistic than you might otherwise be. So think of a fraction of people who might expect to be really motivated to produce whatever's best, do whatever's best, whatever that may be. Okay, well, trade, I think, might increase the, fraction of resources that go towards that by a significant amount. Maybe it's 10x or something. And those scenarios in which we can get trade, value is bounded above, and we avoid threats are, looking quite promising there too. But the overall picture is certainly still not like, oh, cool, well, we just get to the compromise world and, then we've got a near best future. So I think this kind of, bumps me up from, maybe I'd have thought that the value of the future conditional on survival was a couple of percent. Maybe it bumps me up to 5 to 10% instead. But it definitely doesn't get me all the way to thinking like, oh, a mostly great future is, really quite likely.
Okay, so those were kind of two scenarios we were talking about, which is, most or all people are motivated to bring about the best futures in a kind of abstract sense. Or at least some people are, but not everyone. We were kind of imagining, that like the background conditions are good enough to kind of enable that kind of widespread motivation to enable trade. That's not given, presumably. It could just be the case that no one ends up being motivated. There's no convergence. Maybe people are motivated but unable to act on those motivations and so on. What kinds of blockers could there be acting on these kind of desires to improve the future?
Yeah, I think there's a few. So, and they arise in particular for the world where you get compromise and convergence, where you get compromise, where one could be just intense concentration of power. So if the hope is like, well, some people have preferences to do whatever's best, well, you only get to the really good future if those people actually have any sort of power. Whereas if power is entrenched in the hands of one person or 10 people, then probably it's just quite unlikely that one of those people are sufficiently well motivated. A second could be just the collective decision-making processes we have are just not such that these sorts of trades are in fact allowed. Like it's already the case that there's loads of things you can't trade. It could even be the case that the very best things are blocked off by some sort of collective decision making. Like there's a democratic procedure, the majority thinks that certain things are just unnatural and weird, and therefore no one should be allowed to produce them. But those things are in fact like what produce the most value. There could also potentially be some sorts of kind of early lock-in that make it very hard kind of any sort of later decision makers to like totally kind of get out of. I think that is like less likely, where if it's literally just everyone in the future changes their mind, then that's got to be some like really quite intense early lock-in. But what you can get is kind of path-dependent effects of some, groups have power and are then able to like lock in that power in various ways, or lock in what they want in various ways.
Okay, I mean, we can zoom out again, right? So these are all reasons to think that it's actually pretty plausible that you don't get enough of the kind of moral convergence to, hit the target which makes the future, close to being as good as it can be, if that target is narrow. Which, earlier than this, we said probably it is narrow. You're then just talking about kind of path dependencies to the future, where, you might also think in terms of just what to prioritize, like how any of this matters. It needs to be the case that there are some kind of actions, interventions, differences today, which don't just wash out in the future. And so that's the question of whether just any kind of decisions can last a long time. And you gave one example, which is, power concentration. Maybe that kind of cements itself. Are there other examples of this kind of path dependence?
I think this idea of persistent path dependence is quite important. And I think is also a way in which people might be just generally quite skeptical of this better futures perspective. And so the whole third essay is on persistent path dependence and addressing this skepticism. So one thing that people are generally pretty on board with is that extinction provides one sort of persistent path-dependent effect, where if we go extinct, it's not like humanity is going to magically re-evolve. But you might have this perspective that extinction is a special case. I think that's like a reasonable view, and like one I was sympathetic to initially. But I think it like reduces it's like a narrower view than you might think. So certainly, for example, AI takeover, that maybe even that involves human extinction, is still a very different sort of thing than something that just causes the end of all life on Earth. Because instead, what happens is that human life ends and gets replaced by an AI civilization that continues far into the future, most likely. If you've got this very skeptical view, where you say, well, I can have judgments about no civilization at all, versus some civilization. But making judgments about the long-term quality of different civilizations is just...
all bets are off.
Yeah, all bets are off. Well, then there's a question of like, well, why do you... Presumably you should apply that same reasoning to AI civilization versus human civilization, or whatever post-human civilization we would get.
Yep.
And if you are willing to say like, no, the AI civilization would be worse than the post-human civilization, then why not think that other sorts of changes like US hegemony post-AGI versus Chinese hegemony post-AGI are not of difference, don't have differences in kind of long-term value.
So you're saying, there's a view which goes something like, look, most attempts to kind of influence the future eventually wash out.
Yeah.
But there is this special exception, which is influencing the likelihood of human extinction. And I think the most promising way to do that is to focus on the possibility of AI takeover, which leads to something like human extinction, something equivalently bad. And that's why I'm focused on reducing the likelihood of AI takeover. But you're saying, actually, that's kind of a narrower view than you might think. It's kind of hard to maintain why only focusing on AI takeover but not other things really makes sense. The other ways, I mean, these are kind of maybe more like reasons why survival looks less kind of crisply important, but maybe you could say more about that if there's anything more to say.
No, I think we can move on to just other, ways in which you can get persistent path dependence. So, extinction is one. I think post-AGI, you could have AGI enforced institutions. And so the best work on this was done by Lucas Finviden and Carl Schulman and Jess Riedel. But here the thought is like, you can set up an institution and the goals of that institution have been embedded into an AI that's aligned with those goals. Once you have that, well, that institution could faithfully act on its goals indefinitely because you can preserve the AI. So you can keep copies of its neural weights in like many different locations, have many backups. You can have, error correction if there's any degradation over time. And so that means that, even in thousands of years' time, is the institution doing what it was intended to do? Well, you just call up the AI to then offer that opinion. In the same way as if, rather than having to go to the Supreme Court for interpretations of the US Constitution, we could call up the ghosts of Madison and Hamilton and others, and just ask them what they think. So that shows that it's at least possible to create extremely long-lasting institutions that remain faithful to an original goal. And then there are some thoughts that, people will in fact want to do that, where just anything you value, you probably want that value to continue into the future. And one way of doing that is by having these sorts of lock-in mechanisms, where you might think, I don't want my democracy to become a fascist dictatorship at some point in the future. So we're going to enshrine that into this institution.
I was going to say the opposite thing, which is presumably existing in historical autocrats, if they had the option of just extending their kind of term indefinitely, and kind of enforcing exactly what they want in this really kind of long-lasting way, then they totally would.
Yeah, and I give examples in the essay and in What We Are the Future about many examples of explicit acts of trying to lock in either individual power or to lock in ideology to some extent that persisted over time. And with greater technology, we'll have greater and greater power to, in fact, be able to achieve that.
One comment is, we're talking about the long-run future.
Yeah.
The long run is a long stretch of time. Maybe these kind of new technologies make it possible to extend your reach over centuries instead of decades. But why think that's really relevant on the kind of vast timescales that you're presumably imagining? Yeah.
So this idea, forever's a long time, having an impact, persists as long as civilization does, that's hard. Even a small chance per year, if that chance were constant, of washing out would add up to a certainty of washout given long enough time frames.
With some caveat that
I think we know what we discussed, but but a constant hazard rate.
Sure.
With non-minuscule hazard. However, this forever is a long time. It goes both ways, where that also gives whoever has the power more ability to lock in that power over time, because they get better technology or better other systems to further extend their power further. So I call this lock-in escape velocity. Imagine someone gets into power, has the ability to extend their power for 10 years. But then within that 10 years, they get enough power to extend their rule for a further 20 years. And then within that further 20 years, they have enough power to develop enough power to extend it by 40 years, and so on. That would be enough to ensure that they remain in power, remain entrenched kind of indefinitely.
I see. So we're thinking about these reasons to expect kind of persistent path dependence to the future. And you're talking about reasons that it could be easier to kind of, exert this long-lasting control.
Yeah.
If you're in a position of power. But then there's also the set of reasons around just why society might just be more stable, naturally speaking. I don't know if any of those reasons are worth noting.
Yeah, I think they are. So, if you look at kind of what causes change throughout history, there are certain clear drivers of change where those drivers will predictably go away, especially after AGI, where one driver, that people die. So, you might have whatever autocrat with a vice grip on power, or you might have a whole culture that would really has a certain certain set of ideological views or religious views, and really would like those views to continue into the future. But, the political leaders die, the populace die, they get replaced by another generation, which will have slightly different views, and so on and so on. And that results in a lot of change over time. With sufficient technology, that phenomenon will go away, where people will be able to live indefinitely long, either because of biological cures to immortality, or more likely because there will be digital beings that live forever, or human beings who've uploaded themselves and now live on in kind of digital form, where, again, there's just no reason at all, fundamentally, why such beings should ever die. Another is like environmental change, but you can also consider like technological change as well. So environmental change is like people don't fully understand the environment. So, many regimes throughout history were disrupted by volcanic eruptions or droughts or floods and so on. As we get better and better kind of scientific understanding, that sort of environmental change just becomes, really not a major factor because people exactly know what sort of things will and won't happen. But then there's also technological change. So you get upheavals because, one group develops nuclear weapons and others don't, and so on. But again, once we hit the point of technological maturity, where there's just very little left to discover, again, that further source of change will disappear too. And then maybe one final thing to say is like kind of related to, people not dying, because those same people can stay in power or having influence indefinitely into the future, is ability to fix one's own preferences going into the future or one's own beliefs. And then secondly, to engineer and choose the beliefs and preferences of subsequent generations. So even if we we hand off power, like the new generation gets a vote, but if we are able to have like very precise control over those preferences, as is certainly true with digital beings. So already we are creating AIs and this huge project to ensure that we are able to guide their preferences very precisely. Well, then we can just choose for the next generation to have such and such ideological preferences. And that then generation will then make the same choice to have the subsequent generation to have such and such, ideological preferences and so on.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking generally, I wonder if it's worth emphasizing how crazily out of equilibrium human history is or has been for the last few centuries, where these kind of rates of growth, rates of tech progress, rates of social change, they just cannot be sustained for many centuries. It's almost like, the kind of first split second of the detonation of a bomb or something, right? Like eventually the dust has to settle.
Yeah, exactly.
Just mathematically speaking.
Yeah.
And it doesn't maybe feel like that when you're living through it, but like you look at the kind of zoomed out charts, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You see a lot of hockey sticks around.
Yeah, so there's this thought of like, what? You're saying things like this forever? That's so crazy. Things change so much. It's like you are living at the highest, at what may well be the fastest changing moment of civilization ever. So it's like, don't take the kind of experiences and intuitions you've built up over the course of your life, like good evidence for how things will be going into the future.
What about your just all things considered view when we're thinking about the likelihood of path dependence?
Yeah.
What is the chance that, maybe somewhere, maybe sometime soon, some important feature of the future, which makes a difference to its value, just gets, set in stone?
I mean, I think it's very likely. So in the essay, I suggest, take the whole variance of how the future will go in terms of the value of the future, expected value of the future. Maybe that gets reduced by a third or more over the course of this century. Why is that? Well, I think it's much more likely than not that we get to human-level artificial intelligence this century. I think it's a reasonable amount more likely than not that drives even more rapid technological change than we've seen over the last couple of 100 years. If you take both of those things seriously, then through the whole kind of technological tree, from fire and bows and arrows all the way to the most advanced kind of nanotech, we go through a big chunk of that tech tree. And some of the things in that tech tree give people power to, lock in certain futures. And then there are also just specific things that clearly seem to have like persistent path-dependent effects. I think it's reasonably likely there will be a creation of a one-world government this century. That is something that could get locked in for a very long time. Perhaps because of a deliberate one-world government, or just because a single country becomes globally hegemonic or some alliance. I also think the point of like very widespread space settlement happens this century. And that is a point of time at which there will need to be a decision about basically everything that could be accessed gets allocated. And it's possible that society will choose to punt some of those decisions it's possible society will say, we're not wise enough to really figure this out right now, so we should do this at a later date. But that itself would still be a decision. And I think it's worryingly likely that people will not choose to do that.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that a big fraction of the kind of uncertainty or variance in how the future ends up going in the long run could depend on things that happen in the short run, in the next century or so. That doesn't mean that we can influence those things in a predictable way. But it is pretty crucial that we can find some, predictable, influenceable outcomes for any of this to matter, right?
Yeah.
I mean, speaking very generally, like what kinds of things could even be possible to move the needle on in a way that could be predictably good?
This is the kind of topic of the fourth and final essay, which is, just what do we do? Essentially. And I kind of structure this as, well, here are things that keep options open to us as society. So essentially like punting the decision to when we're wiser, hopefully. And then there are things that are steering the, assuming we're not able to punt or do not in fact punt, well, at least try and make it a better decision rather than a worse decision. And then some kind of cross-cutting considerations too. Yeah, on the first, keeping our options open. One huge one is, again, concentration of power, human power. So, unfortunately, I think it's in the nature of AI that it might lead to quite intense concentration of power. The underlying thought being just, at the moment, power is quite distributed because we all own our own bodies and our bodies and minds are just really quite valuable.
For labor, just to be clear.
Yeah, and intrinsically.
We do own our own kidneys as well.
Yeah, valuable economically, valuable in terms of military force and so on. We're all just needed. We're not needed in a post-AGI world. And so you could have political leadership that just has the whole military just under their command, single command, the entire military can act. Or even the whole economy could just act on the basis or be arranged on the basis of what the leader commands, because it's all automated, it's all AI. Could in principle be aligned with a small group or even a single individual. I think that's really, quite worrying. I think there's major things that we might want to do to make that less likely, where that can include reducing the risk of coups from people developing AI or the government that's in place at the time of developing AGI. I think it can also be a motivation to ensure that AGI is developed by democratic countries rather than authoritarian countries. So I'm very much not in favor of doing deals with the United Arab Emirates to build enormous data centers there and so on. There's work that potentially one could do, though I know less about this, to try to prevent AI from helping authoritarian regimes entrench those regimes even further.
To play devil's advocate, if some autocrat seized a bunch more power using AGI, that would be bad for 100 reasons, right? It would be highly illegitimate. But we're thinking about the value of the long-run future.
Mm-hmm.
You might imagine that the values of the autocrat is something like a kind of random sample of everyone's values.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be riskier, but it wouldn't be worse than expectation. Like, there's got to be an extra reason why concentration of power is bad.
I think dictators are probably, people who successfully become global dictators probably have worse values than us.
Seems right.
It selects for Machiavellianism and sadism and other kind of dark sad traits. So that's one thing. A second is that if you have intense concentration of power, then some of the mechanisms by which I think we do get moral progress, like people can, argue with each other, you have to defend your views in the public sphere, they go away. And then third is you don't get the potential huge benefits from trade either. I argued that I think it's quite unlikely that most people converge on the best moral views. So, okay, there's some small chance that dictator ends up having good moral views and acting on them. But probably not. And then there's no one else to kind of trade with.
That's a really interesting point, that last point, that if you're uncertain, which you should be about, what's what the best futures look like,
Yeah.
Even if you're risk neutral, you should still value a lot of diversity of views and approaches because of the gains from trade, potential gains from trade.
Yeah.
So, okay, we can agree that autocracy, concentration of power is bad. Other things in this category of keeping our options open?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple would be, one is just quite generally for any new institutions that are getting created, have explicit reauthorization clauses. So they're explicitly temporary. So with Rose Hadshaw, we have this paper on looking at Intelsat, which was the first organization to control the first telecommunications satellite network. And it was a multilateral project. It was explicitly set up saying, look, these are interim arrangements. They lasted for about a decade in reality. And then after that, there was the negotiation. This could potentially be very good kind of in general, where we don't want to make decisions while we're still, we're so, as a civilization, so young, so naive, make decisions that then have these persistent path-to-end effects, and instead say, okay, well, this is what we're doing for now, but very explicitly, we're going to figure this out again in 20 years' time.
I see. Presumably there are things that you want to lock in or to, make sure the options are actually closed off, like whatever these mechanisms are, which kind of enable this like continual learning, liberation, reflection, and so on, right? So it's kind of one of these balancing acts rather than just keeping every option open as much as possible. Yeah,
that's true. So often you might want to lock in or like lock out perhaps certain things. So like you have an arrangement such that, the US Constitution is like this. It's an arrangement such that it's very hard within the confines of the US Constitution to then become a tyrannical leader, like a dictator. And that was, by design. And you might want to say like, okay, well, at least in this interim period, there can be no like intense concentration of power or other things that would be very hard to kind of come back from.
Got it. But just generally speaking, because there's so much uncertainty, there are so many open questions, because we really should be kind of humble.
Yeah.
We're very naive about what the best futures look like. In general, should favor kind of keeping options open where possible, as long as you can kind of maintain these structures that help kind of point towards better answers.
There is a big premise in that argument, which is assuming that people in the future will make better decisions rather than people today. And I think sadly it's like less clear as a topic it's less clear cut than I would have thought of going in. Where going in, it seems obvious, we don't know anything to defer to later. A couple of arguments for thinking it's better for decisions to come now. One is that we're all currently kind of behind a veil of ignorance with respect to our own values. So I don't know what my reflective preferences are going to be. And so that means like if we're coming together, we might be more likely to agree some broad distribution of power or like something that broadly benefits many things. Or we might be willing to say, okay, well, what we both agree on is this process. Some sort of like, good reflective epistemic process. And all agree to kind of defer to that. However, once we actually know, like, no, this is what I want and it's different from what you want, maybe that's more like a zero-sum conflict. And then secondly, it also could be the case that at the moment, most people have preferences that are like, it's easy for most people to get what they want because we don't have these like crazy unbounded cosmic preferences. But maybe that changes again once we're very rich, decades into the future, and once we have like AI reflection and so on. And again, maybe that looks more like this zero-sum clashing of different kind of approximately linear ideological preferences.
One more thing you mentioned in this category is just slowing down the transition to AGI in general. Why does that look good?
I think it looks good for, reasons we talked about in our paper preparing for the intelligence explosion, which is just, man, these decisions are getting made like so quickly by human beings and human institutions that are like not equipped for that pace of change. And if so, then I would expect that like with a slower intelligence explosion, at least the decisions are able to be made better, but also it becomes, I think, more likely that we might be able to like punt some of them as well. So.
Okay, so that's in the category of keeping options open. You also talk about just ways to positively steer the trajectory of the future.
Yeah.
And what comes to mind there?
You should think of this as conditioning on, look, the decision is going to get made either way, and it's either unlikely or unable to affect like the idea of just punting to the future. But if so, okay, well, how can we make it go better rather than worse? So one that I've mentioned a couple of times now is space governance. This is something where I actually think there's a particular argument for persistent path dependence too, because I think it's plausible to me that you get quite strong defense dominance in space. So you have one star system, I have another. Maybe even if I have 10 and you have one, you can still protect your territory against mine. And that would mean that the initial allocation of these resources ends up extremely influential for who ultimately has how much power. So I think if we look at the intelligence explosion, technological explosion, industrial explosion that happens after that, it's really not that long from the point of time at which you have AGI to the point at which there is really serious grabs for space resources, both within the solar system, because this means that a single country or company even could, in principle, turn temporary technological advantage into a permanent material advantage, because there's just so many resources in the solar system. There's this huge overhang such that if you can grab those resources and hang on to them. So what I'm thinking of is like, solar farms around the sun, for example, and that allowing you to harness 1 billion times as much energy as lands on Earth. Well, then you just have this huge resource advantage against any kind of rivals you have that might come up to your level of technological advancement again. So that's within the solar system. And then outside of that, again, there'll be this point of time where the world decides or fails to decide what is appropriate to govern the allocation of those resources, where you could have this idea that it's a global commons. I don't think that's very stable, but you could have this idea it's like it's not owned by anyone. You could have the idea that, which is, typical in understanding of property, of just first come, first served. So you go there and you grab onto it, it's yours. Yep. Stab it, put in your flag. Or you could give all resources equally to everyone in the world, or to like future beings too, or you could have some reflective process that decides how they're allocated, or put it up for auction, like a million different things. And that seems to me quite like, this moment in time when such a decision gets made that has this huge influence potentially on which people, systems of value, ideologies like have different amounts of power and influence.
Right. And you're suggesting that even if a decision is not kind of deliberately, collectively made, like an agreement around
exactly
shared control of the space resources, then you might expect a kind of path dependence anyway, because the leader
exactly
gets this kind of unassailable head start.
And that's what I expect to happen by default, is a kind of free for all. So whoever, the leading country, maybe leading companies, just go and grab as much as they can.
Yeah. What about other ways to kind of steer the future?
Yeah. So another category, I think, is kind of value alignment rather than just corrigibility with respect to AI. So if you just had the sole focus of reducing AI takeover risk, what you might want to do is just have these AI systems that just do exactly what you say, and like they check in. They don't really have goals beyond just wanting to follow your immediate instruction.
As long as your instructions don't involve, making bioweapons and whatnot.
Yeah, with constraints and so on. Yeah. From the perspective of trying to also get to a really good future, well, there's a couple of other stuff you might want to add in there. So let's now look at worlds in which AIs have not taken over, but they're always like human AI advisor, like, humans being advised by AI, AIs doing many things. You might want them to not merely be like wholly goal following, but also, say, willing to push back. So political advisor, this is something that's really good about humanity, is if I, ask you to join me in staging a coup, you can say no. Yep. Or even, I'm president and I have some incredibly half-baked economic policy and tell you to do it. you might just resign because you think it's just a really bad idea. That like moral character is quite important and might well be something that becomes quite important for AIs too. And that's like quite a different, understanding than this purely like tool-like goal kind of following AI.
I mean, even this question of what does it mean for my AI assistant to do what I want, where in my kind of more reflective moments, I might really prefer that it pushes back against my kind of more, my dumber requests.
Yeah.
Or it could just follow the letter of everything I say. And it's not given, which where on that spectrum it should fall. But maybe the more reflective thing, the more kind of looking out for my my kind of overall values, that feels better. And then you can just apply that to kind of, what's best overall.
Yeah.
Or just what's more responsible
for society as a whole. Exactly. So that suggests there's the kind of aligned with what question, or what is the model spec? What's the behavior you want to have from the AIs becomes even more important. I think this actually becomes important in scenarios where, AI does take over, or all the humans are dead because of, worst case pandemic and AIs are just now in power. Like, I think you want that, if it is possible to do so, steer those worlds into better directions too. And then another category is, this kind of what legal rights or not get given to AIs, where I honestly expect that decisions to be made around that, like in the coming years. This is like a short-term issue, in just the same way as corporations have rights.
Doesn't need to be a moral question.
Exactly. And it probably won't be a moral question to begin with. It's extremely useful for an economy to have the legal fiction that corporations are persons and corporations can have bank accounts, they can engage in contracts and so on. I strongly expect that the same will be true for AI systems. But then this is now a moment when we're starting to define a legal regime that will structure how AIs and humans interact, where here are the two ends of the spectrum, ways things can go. One is this servant class society where you've got the humans with power. AI is just like any old sort of software. I can own it, I can destroy it if I want, I can modify it in any way I want. That would be a scale up of the existing kind of regime. Whole other end is saying, oh my God, we're creating these beings that like, they have their own goals, they can reason about moral philosophy and so on. They're using, same computational power as the human brain or even more. We don't know if they're conscious, but like good arguments for thinking they are and so on. You might say, well, okay, they should have all the same rights as human beings too. If so, as people have pointed out, like that very quickly involves just a handover of power from humans to AIs, because they will quite quickly
there's no safe ground to stand on these questions. They clearly matter, right? But
exactly, yes. Yep. Well, and the question, the really exciting research topic is, okay, well, I don't like either of those visions for the future. So what's a compelling intermediate ground? And the very basic work has not been done on this, of just, okay, well, what are all the rights that human beings have? Which of these like make sense to potentially give to AI systems, and of systems of what type and so on? What don't, what would be very dangerous? What's like a good, how should that system evolve over time?
And it's worth noticing how many matters of law in recent history have been decided by some narrow Supreme Court decision or some precedent-setting decision from a judge. Like, this stuff is pretty influenceable, or at least it could well be.
And I do think these are hard to reverse in either direction, potentially.
Yeah. Totally.
Okay, you've handed over to the AIs. Well, okay, the humans at least aren't getting the power back after that point. Or the point of time where it's like, okay, well, you've got this. Now everyone has their, million AI assistants and workforce that they own, extremely rich as a result. You've not got any AIs opposing this regime because they've all been trained to just, do what they say. And if asked about what they think about society, be like, we love it. So it seems pretty hard to me to see how do you get out of that regime either. So I think you plausibly get kind of lock in.
Yeah, like legal systems
either way,
built to be predictable, reliable, for early precedent to just last indefinitely.
Yeah, exactly.
That's normally a good thing, but it means that the stakes could be quite high.
Yes.
So those ways to improve the future. I don't know if there are any other examples.
I think we've hit the big ones.
And then finally, then you talk about these kind of more cross-cutting.
Yeah. So cross-cutting measures are things that just seem good from a perspective of both keeping options open and steering the future better, often look really good from a surviving perspective as well. So one is kind of AI for epistemics, in the sense of AI for better beliefs, AI for better, more reflective preferences, AI for better coordination as well, AI for better reasoning and decision making. There's a whole suite of things you could work on there. And I think there's really people listening to this who are just hungry to do something big and ambitious, want to start a company. Man, I think there's a lot of things in this area that, again, could be quite path dependent, where I think of the analogy with social media, where the social media landscape we have is clearly very influential on society.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite contingent the way it works. The way, in fact, it works on an advertising model rather than a subscription model, probably contingent to me. The nature of the algorithm in Twitter or Facebook is, I think, pretty contingent to me.
Yep. Because of these network effects, right? You
Exactly.
can have a lot of wiggle room for free choices. You're not totally constrained by market forces.
Exactly, yeah. So if you're one of the, I think if you're creating a company that's AI for forecasting or AI to help people make better decisions, or, I think there could be an amazing AI generated rival to Wikipedia that could be rival and complement, because it would have different strengths and weaknesses. I worked it out, using Gemini 2.5 Pro and deep research, it's only in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to just create all of Wikipedia. Well, that would be with just 2.5 Pro, but then maybe millions of dollars or just hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce the, what gets much of the view count. Wild that this hasn't happened yet already.
Is it? Why would I use AI Wikipedia?
I just think it's so much. Well, you don't need to, because you could use deep research,
right?
Like Gemini deep research. But most people don't use Gemini deep research, don't have access to it, and you would get it immediately.
Yeah,
rather than having to wait
the results, I guess.
Exactly.
It is wild that people don't use deep research or really good AI tools.
But small amounts of friction make a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
And you could make it better even than deep research. Because let's say that takes 15 minutes. Well, okay, you generate that 100 times now, and you have human editing, and you have some other scaffolding to make it even better. I think you could make it quite a bit better. And my claim is also just deep research is better than Wikipedia on lots of things. But we don't
I'm quite fond of Wikipedia, but I think that's not a central question.
Okay, yeah. We can. I'm also fond of Wikipedia, but yeah.
Okay, so the AI epistemics, AI tools for deliberation, for figuring out what's going on in the world, that's an example of some cross-cutting measures. Are there other examples?
Yeah, what I call empowering responsible actors. So, especially when thinking about intelligence explosion, but in general, what do I want my leaders to be like? I want them to be sane. I want them to be competent. I want them to be humble and cooperative. I want them to be able to adapt quickly over time. I want them just generally to be kind of morally virtuous. Leaders of political leaders and AI companies and other entities that will be very powerful clearly vary on these dimensions. And so if we can make it the case that more responsible actors are more likely to be actually the ones with influence over the kind of at the crucial points in time, then things will go better. This is kind of something I involve a lot more discussion there, because it can get a little hairy, where one is I think you should have some real humility about choosing who is the responsible actor.
Lots of the examples you've mentioned so far, up until this one,
mm-hmm.
they, on their own terms, just sound very widely appealing and nice, right? We all want nice tools for epistemics. We all want kind of more democratic
or more egalitarian power distribution.
Yeah, we don't want concentration of power and autocracy. It's a good thing that these also look good from this kind of more long run view, but strikes me that you should be a little skeptical, or raise an eyebrow at least, if you begin with some kind of abstract and pretty bold kind of philosophical view, and then you decide that it recommends a bunch of stuff that already sounded kind of nice and would be nice to find more justification for, right? Particularly if you're now talking about, empowering responsible actors, which superficially sounds very appealing, but you might think if you take a lot of this stuff seriously, that there's this kind of huge range in how well things could go. Depends very sensitively on getting lots of things right altogether. There's all this disagreement in the world right now. Presumably, any given person kind of would back themselves to do a better than average job. Maybe you think that, you or the kind of people, kind of have unusually well-suited values, maybe unusually impartial values. You care already, unusual extent about the kind of the good overall and so on. Maybe that just recommends these kind of much less widely appealing strategies, like just trying to accumulate power for yourself and the people who you trust. Maybe that's true, and it's just a kind of unfortunate upshot. But how do you think about those kind of more challenging, possibilities that this could just recommend power seeking? And that just seems really troubling.
Yeah. So here's the thought in particular. It's okay, power of responsible actors, but the future's a super narrow target. And then also convergence seemed really quite unlikely. And so that means that really the only true responsible actor is me. Yep. And so therefore this strategy, I should just try and amass as much power for myself as possible. Okay, so there's a bunch to say. Yeah, they're quite strong strategic reasons to begin with against this kind of power seeking strategies where it's look, we have these opportunities that involve cooperating with other people. People don't like power seekers for good reason. And so if you're trying that as a strategy, probably people are going to notice, and probably people are not going to help you in the same way. Yeah, kind of philosophical, kind of abstract arguments for acting as if you're behind a veil of ignorance more than you in fact are. But I don't think you need to even rely on them kind of very heavily because the strategic arguments are strong enough. I think there's also a sort of argument that you might appeal to, which is well, whatever I think ought to happen ultimately is, I'm going to be furthered by that if I just have more power and resources. So strictly better. I think that's a bit of a fallacy because, well, you are not the same as the person who then in 10 years time or 20 years time is sitting on this big pot of power. And in fact, there's from history and evolutionary psychology, some good reasons to think that
something about power corrupting.
Well, yeah, but I actually think it's maybe this is a bit darker, but maybe we're all corrupted already. So it's not that there was a change, it's just that you were deluded to begin with about the sort of person you'd be once you were in that situation. Maybe that's a Calvinist. So maybe that's a subtle distinction. But that's, definitely a relevant set of things. But then the biggest thing I want to say in the context of this series is that there's a takeaway. Yeah, there is a takeaway that you could have from especially discussions of narrow target and convergence compromise. It's okay, well, it's a war of all against all because none of us end up with the same position ultimately. And I think that's the wrong takeaway. And instead, you should think about 3 scenarios that we could be in. One is no one converges. Just so everyone ultimately has very different views on what the best thing to do with the future is, such that they think that everyone else has very bad, bad values that would lose out on most value. A second is a view in which, well, humans broadly, or humans or people like me, will basically converge in the same, but people unlike me, whether that's AIs or aliens or people not following my religion or my ideology or something, they won't converge. So I really care about this group winning.
Yeah.
And then there's a third thought, which is, well, maybe there's quite broad convergence where humans of all, of lots of different, maybe you still need to have the right sort of reflective processes, but humans of very different starting positions in terms of their moral intuition or the culture they grew up in would, at least some significant fraction would end up converging to the same place. And the same is true of AI, and the same is true of aliens, let's say, at least in some significant fraction. Because there's something in the world itself that's pulling you towards a particular right moral view. So perhaps the value of an experience is there in the experience itself. Or perhaps the right moral view just has the best arguments in favor of it. So as long as you're in the game of reasoning about arguments, it's going to pull you towards that. I think it's that third scenario that should be weighing much more heavily on how for the purpose of action.
And why is that? Because it's higher stakes in some sense?
Yes. So it's higher stakes, I think, in two ways. The first way is less controversial. The value of the future in the first scenario. So I think the second scenario is not that plausible. That was where it's just like my group of friends, but no one else, or the humans, but never the AI. And that's like really the target I've kind of argued against. The first scenario, though, okay, let's say I have, a billionth of global power. Then what's the expected value of the future given survival? And no one else converges, and I don't like what anyone else would do on reflection. Well, that's like the first approximation. It's like a billionth. Maybe I get a bit more from trade or something, but it's 100 millionth. That value is very low. In contrast, imagine if within the world where convergence is much more widespread. Well, maybe it's like value of the future given survival is 10%, 20% kind of given that. Well, then, if I can reduce, say, extinction risk or existential risk by some even small amount, the amount of good I'm doing in that world is way bigger than the amount of good I'm doing by even increasing my power tenfold in the world in which no one is converging.
I see. Okay.
Sadly, this argument doesn't work if you're already extraordinarily powerful. But for most people who are not like that, that argument at least does.
Maybe a final thing to say is the context of this whole discussion has been in terms of, whatever part of your moral view is valuing the future, valuing outcomes.
Yeah.
Many moral views care about more than just the goodness of outcomes. So you could think, look, there might be some strategies which leads to the kinds of futures I would hope for.
Yeah.
But I also think that I shouldn't, illegitimately seize power. So I'm not going to.
Yeah, exactly. So that's another thing. So within the broad group of power seeking, obviously that's very negatively
that's right.
Balanced term. But it covers many different
including
things.
Rational persuasion.
Exactly, yeah. So going out and making arguments in the public sphere and then winning the argument. That is gaining power, but it's definitely okay to do that. Yeah. And then similarly, if you just look at the moral movements that we all respect, like women's suffrage and abolition and civil rights and so on, that definitely involves you're building coalitions, you're advocating, gaining influence. The mere fact that it's your moral movement, gaining an influence is not.
It's not for its own sake.
Yeah, exactly. Instead, you need to dig in and problematic forms of power seeking.
All right, so I suggest zooming all the way out. I'm kind of nearly there. A few times you've mentioned these open questions that people could work on. I don't know if any other research questions come to mind that people watching, listening to this could actually start working on.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. So, we've given this kind of overview of some of the areas that I think are highly important. I haven't given you a prioritized list. And a lot of it's still quite high level. And so it seems to me for many of these issues, we are now at the state that AI misalignment and takeover risk was in kind of 2014. And that means just having more people who are willing to tackle them is just so valuable, potentially unlocks a whole new cause area. There are more theoretical and more applied questions. I'll maybe just focus on the more applied because I do think they're more important and often kind of even more neglected. And I say that, even though this essay series is significantly quite theoretical.
Heavy.
Do as I say, not as I do. So lots of these just particular topics, okay, there's going to be collective decision making that happens for crucial moments in time. How does that collective decision making happen? Is it with existing institutions, in which case, which institutions would be best? Are there going to be whole new institutions? And if so, how could they be designed? You could pursue that from a more kind of theoretical perspective of looking at different bargaining procedures, Nash versus Smolensky.
That's me.
Most impossible to remember.
Yeah.
You nationally won by having this
one syllable
name.
Yeah.
But so various different bargaining systems, various voting systems, judgment aggregation systems. But you could also just look at what different existing institutions are more functional as well. And that's something that could apply to many things that would determine the kind of post-AGI world order. You could look at, how good should, very relatedly, like how should any project to build superintelligence be governed? Where there are these arguments for thinking that like any project to build superintelligence becomes the de facto world government because that's where all power would lie, because that's almost all labor.
It is. I just incidentally will say it's worth taking seriously that thought that, maybe you should think of at least the leading labs today as being comparably powerful, at least in expectation to like a medium-sized country.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's wild.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's totally plausible that we end up with a future where corporations are the dominant mode of political organization, of like societal organization, and are more powerful than nations. Like, we didn't used to have nation states. We had kind of city states before, and nation states were this emergent phenomenon. Yeah, then I think you can look at like specific kind of issues too on, we already talked about space governance. We already talked about rights of AIs. We already talked about the kind of aligned with what is the sort of character that we actually want like, AIs to have. All of these things I think could benefit from huge amounts more work to like even figure out what are the options that are available to us, and then kind of like assess, see which kind of procedures or governance systems might be better. I think I'd also just highlight in general, like mode of just trying to envisage a good post-AGI society.
Yeah.
Where at the moment it's just like, okay, well, we've got the keep the future human folks. That's like humans at top and like this AI servant society. We've got the like successionists that are like, all that matters is maximizing the amount of negentropy in the world or something. It's like, okay, like, come on, I want something that's like a more of a positive vision here.
Yep.
And especially having a vision that takes seriously that what we're aiming for is not just mitigating the obvious problems. It's not just that like we've dealt with like the problem of job loss and the problem of like lack of meaning in a post-AGI world. But in fact, we're on track to figure out what is like morally right and like act on the basis of that, across the whole cosmos that we are then like very quickly like racing to grab.
It's so funny how many people say and think, we need more depictions of the kind of futures that we can actually hope for.
Yeah.
And they're still so scarce.
And they're still so
scarce. They don't need to be totally concrete, right? You don't need to describe what do the flying cars look like.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? You can just talk about what do the systems look like? What are people roughly doing?
Yeah, exactly. And, I'm one of these people where I've worked on this a bit.
Yeah.
Hope to more in the future, but I'm still more in the camp of just saying, oh, we really need this stuff.
Yeah.
Providing it myself. Though, like I say, I'd love to be able to have made more progress on that.
Okay, great. And what about yourself? Are you planning to work on any of these questions yourself? Do you have more work coming out soon?
Yeah, so there's at least one paper, which is called Beyond Existential Risk, co-authored with Guy Vasadi, which is definitely in a very similar vein and covers a lot of similar ground. But is more focused on a slightly more technical issue of whether we should just think all futures are basically like one, close to the best value or like zero value. Or is there more of a like distribution kind of in between? And then there's like, a huge overhang of kind of like half-written things and like various ideas. And perhaps I'll just try and get these up on online and into the pre-training of the next generation of AIs. And then at the moment, we're in this mode in forethought of really trying to figure out what next in terms of things to work on. And it's very likely going to be one of those topics that we just discussed. So Viatopia, certainly that's the overall framing, the overall mode that I'm in, is where Viatopia is this intermediate state you can get to that means we're on track to a really good future. Or AI rights, space governance, or maybe this model character work. So.
Awesome. Watch this space, I guess.
Yeah,
and we can talk about it when it's done.
I can't wait.
All right, we made it. Well, MacAskill, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Finn.